our virtual deep dive. Today we're going to spend a few hours talking about some deployment strategies, essentially some best practice and recommendations we think you all should benefit from. And hopefully you're able to turn around and help customers understand, as you talk with partners, help them to understand the way forward in getting AMP for Endpoints deployed in a way that works well for customers. And so, as mentioned, today's session is recorded, so you'll be able to refer back to it. We've got a couple hours, just over a couple of hours of content, even though there's a 4-hour block on your calendar. What we're hoping for is that you folks come and ask questions, raise your hand, and make it as interactive as possible. We've got a panel of presenters today, and so and some great folks on for Q&A also. And so whether you want to ask your question in the chat or in the Q&A panel or live, we'll appreciate both, but hopefully looking to make this a great interactive session. With that, we'll kick it off with Jesse Munoz getting us started for today. It's on you, Jesse.
Awesome. Can you pass me the ball, please?
Sure, I'll do that.
So good morning, everybody. Well, it's morning for me anyway, and welcome. So this is a session we put together around AMP for Endpoint's best practices, specifically focusing on a deployment methodology that I've sat down and with the help of Alex and Jeremy, we looked at exactly how customers tend to go about deploying AMP and where they tend to go wrong. And we developed this methodology to help ensure that as customers go through the deployment process, they don't hit the same stumbling blocks that we've seen time and time again in the past. Let me see if I can get my screen shared out here, and hopefully things work nicely. Sorry, one second. It looks like HipChat just froze on me, so let me kill the process off. There we go. Okay, is everybody seeing my PowerPoint slides?
We are.
Okay, and am I giving you the right view here?
Yes, we've got full slide view.
Okay, great. It's always nice when things more or less work the way they're supposed to. Okay, so a little bit about me real quick. So I work under Eric as a TME on the advanced threat side of the house. Prior to that, I spent about 4.5 years working support escalations for AMP for Endpoints. So the last about 5 years, I've pretty much lived and breathed AMP every day. I've got a BBA in Information Systems and Cybersecurity if anybody cares. I'm not sure I do anymore. And beyond that, I'm ready to dive into the information here. So our journey is pretty much breaking things down into the pieces that we care about, how each step of the deployment process should go, and what we should expect to do within each step. One other housekeeping note before I dive any farther in, if you have any questions as we go along, any items that you want to bring up to discuss, feel free to throw a hand up and stop me, and we can dive any deeper into any portion of this that you would like to have a discussion about. There's also some quizzes along the way. Jeremy put together some Kahoot stuff for us, so we'll be taking online roll of who uses those, and we'll be sending out a little gift card prize afterwards for whoever scores the best on those quizzes. I think with that, I've covered all the housekeeping notes, and let's go ahead and move on. So the focus that I want to bring to things is, where do we start with the deployment? Because often people love to, I've seen customers, they get access to their AMP for Endpoints console, they run in there, they download a connector, drop it into SCCM, and deploy to 5,000 endpoints. I've seen that more times than I want to count, and it bothers me every time because every single time it is inevitably a problem. They run into issues with incompatible software, they run into issues with exclusions, they run into issues with unsupported operating systems, all of a sudden, mission critical systems are having performance problems, or they're blue screening, something's misbehaving, they're getting duplicates in their console. All of these are avoidable issues that can be handled with prior proper preparation. And a lot of that boils down to, well, what do we need to do to prepare before we go to deploy, and how do we deploy in such a way that if we hit a problem that we didn't anticipate, that we can account for that problem and not have it affect our broader environment as we move forward. So branching out and building each of these phases is looking for ways to make that easier. So the deployment journey that we put together is 6 stages for the deployment, where we gather some information based on what the current environment looks like. We figure out how we want to approach the deployment. We configure our console to match that deployment setup and make sure that we've accounted for known issues in our environment. And then we start doing a staged rollout, right? We roll out to a few endpoints, we gather some data from the field, we roll out to a broader base of endpoints, we gather some more data, and all along this path, we're tuning our connector so that at the end of the day, when we hit general deployment, we hit everybody all at once, it works, and we don't have major issues appear. So my big key takeaway here, and the one thing that I cannot emphasize enough, is always deploy AMP in stages. If we can deploy AMP in stages, we can prevent most of the heartburn that customers suffer when they decide to deploy AMP for the first time. This flowchart is a little complicated. Evgeny put together a nicer one that I need to incorporate into this deck. But effectively, what we want to do is step through each of these stages and remember that stage 4A, B, and stage 5 all roll back into stage 3. We're just going to take information from the field and we're going to dump it back into our console, and we're going to continue tuning and refining the product to match our environmental requirements as we move along. So from here, what I want to do is dive into each stage and discuss what we can expect from each stage of the deployment and how we make decisions based on the information that we're getting. So stage 1 is all about information gathering. Things that we know already exist in the field that we need to bring together and have documented somewhere so that we can incorporate it into the product as we move forward. So environmental data gathering, that's what this whole process is about right here. What endpoints do I have? What operating systems are they running? How many of them do I have? Where are they physically located? Are their operating systems supported, and do they need to be supported? Maybe we have some one-off operating systems that aren't covered by our existing security product, and they're not expected to be covered by our new security product. Will our existing endpoint security product be remaining? Are we just bringing AMP in as an additional security product? Maybe our old license isn't expired yet. Maybe we decided we want to have coverage from multiple vendors. Either way, we can accommodate that. It's simply knowing ahead of time what we need. Knowing what our mission critical systems are. Do I have web servers, SQL servers, email servers? Do I have a file server that's hosting mission critical data that everybody in the enterprise needs to get to at any point in time and cannot be down? If so, what are those systems? Where are they located, and how am I going to handle those systems specifically? What is the deployment mechanism that I'm using in my environment? Am I using Microsoft SCCM? Am I deploying with third-party tools from SolarWinds? Am I using group policy deployments? Do I have a Mac shop, and am I using JAMF or an MDM to manage my endpoints? And I want to call out this one specifically. Is there a proxy in my environment? Everything I have heard from the field says if you've got a large enterprise environment, there's going to be a proxy. And your endpoint team, they're probably not going to know that there's a proxy. They're probably going to go, oh yeah, we don't have one of those in our environment, and then deployment day rolls around, and they deploy to those first few endpoints, and not a single one of them works. And they can't figure out why. And then you spend an hour trying to figure out why. And inevitably, there's a network guy managing a proxy somewhere in the network, and you got to get that proxy configured, and that network guy, yeah, he doesn't come in until next Monday. Inevitably, this is what happens. And so what do we end up doing? We end up spinning our wheels. The customer's not happy because their deployment schedule just completely got blown out of the water, and you're not happy because you just spent an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours trying to diagnose connectivity problems with the endpoint for a known issue that the customer just didn't think to take into account. So please validate proxies. It's so important. Another question is, do we have organizational requirements, privacy requirements? Are there governmental policy requirements that we need to meet, and how are we going to address them? Things like the credit payment informations. Sorry, what's the term here? Credit payment information systems or something like that for swiping credit cards. They have certain governmental policies that you have to meet in order to use those systems. Do we have those in place? For EU, I believe it's GDPR is another example of that. So from there, what other security products are we running? What exclusions do those security products have in place? Is that security product blocking IP addresses, managing the system firewall? Is it managing an endpoint blacklist or whitelist for applications? Does it have security features such as in-memory exploit prevention? Does it have user behavior analytics or some kind of malware or ransomware blocking engine? And how do those engines function, and how are they configured within the existing product? What information can I take from that may be applicable to AMP for endpoints, and how do I pull that information out and get it documented in a way that's functional and usable to our team when we go to perform a deployment? Auditing and compliance. Excuse me. This is the term I kept coming back to and failing to get right, was auditing and compliance. So PCI DSS and GDPR. Also, another one is historical data retention. We see this all the time. We get requests for this all the time. And right now, what I want to tell you is AMP will store 30 days worth of data. It will not store any more than 30 days worth of data. We do not have an option to sell more than 30 days worth of historical data retention at this time. So be aware of that requirement. If the customer has historical data retention requirements, direct them to the API. We have a streaming API that will filter all event data straight down to their SIM and allow them to store that data internally and manage their historical data retention requirements in their own environment. Additionally, if they want to do complex querying against the AMP API, there are threshold limits that are in place that will prevent them from running excessive numbers of complex queries against that API. And if they do, and if it starts becoming a performance bottleneck for our back-end servers, we will shut that API down. So recommended best practice is to use that API to pull data to the SIEM locally, and from there, run all of your data queries that are performance heavy. So once we've gotten through this information gathering stage and we've answered all these questions, and more that I'm sure that aren't on the slides that will occur at the time that you're going through the process, now we need to talk about deployment planning and how we bring those pieces together, how we incorporate all of that data that we've gathered into a methodology specific to the customer environment. And I really love this quote because I've done this so many times, this whole, I read deployment guides and I see it just like I see science fiction. I get to the end and I go, yeah, I don't have time for that. And I think every customer has been to that or been through that process. I know I've been through it. I know our SDs and CSEs, they experience this on a very regular basis when they go to deploy a new customer. You know, we can give methodology and best practices, and we can recommend, and we can try to help push them to operate things cleanly and in a methodical, forthright way. But until they're ready to do that themselves, until their management is on board with that attempt, it's a little difficult. Stage 2, customers need to ask themselves, do I want to run private cloud or public cloud? And what are the different issues inherent in running one versus the other? So, along with that, which deployment mechanism am I using and how am I going to use it? So we talked about gathering the information about it, but staging the data within that, building out the groups within that product so that we can target the appropriate endpoints at each stage along this path is just as important as knowing which mechanism it is. I can hand an SCCM guy a package and tell him, go deploy it to these endpoints, but if he hasn't got an idea of how to deploy it to the endpoints that I want only and what those groups look like, it's going to turn into another problem. Okay, so let's take a second, let's talk about public cloud and its requirements. Now, public cloud allows customers to offload all of the data storage, all of the data processing, all of the hardware requirements other than the endpoint connector to Cisco and our cloud environment. So basically what you need to run it is an internet connection, a supported operating system, a little bit of hard drive space. I think 1 gigabyte these days is considered to be a little bit of hard drive space, but other people disagree with me. It really depends. You can have it as small as 100 megabytes if you don't turn on the Tetra engine. The Tetra engine will use between 500 and 700 megabytes on average. We say 1 gigabyte just to be safe and allow room for growth in the signature definition files. So the best practice recommendation here is public cloud. It's the easiest to deploy, it's the fastest to get set up, and it's the cheapest to operate in the long run. Private cloud is not a bad option either, but we find that mostly institutions with very high privacy requirements, with government contracts, or three-letter agencies, or your in-house government agencies as well, are the primary customers for this product. Now, I'm not going to discourage anyone from selling private cloud to any customer that wants it. Go for it. But be aware, private cloud is not code equivalent to the public cloud environment. Our engines are not the same. You do not get exploit prevention. You do not get system process prevention. You do not get malicious activity prevention. You don't get cognitive intelligence in there. And the Ethos engine is older. It's not as it is not as up to date as the current Ethos engine in public cloud. The development timeline to bring these things together, the pace of releases for private cloud should be speeding up in the next year, and we're hoping to have them code equivalent within 2 to 3 months, within a 2 to 3 month incorporation of new code into private cloud sometime in the next year and a half. But exactly what that timeline looks like, it's really hard to say at the moment. Some other requirements: we don't have Android or iOS support on private cloud. The hardware requirements for running the private cloud virtual machine are fairly substantial. You'll need solid-state enterprise hard drives and RAID 10 configuration just to run it. It requires 60K IOPS for write and 30K IOPS for read in order to handle the data load. And it has a maximum of 10,000 connectors per private cloud instance. Now, some integrations exist for both products. There are significantly more for public cloud than there are for private cloud. You don't get MX integration. You don't get umbrella integration. And you don't get CTA. Those are the big ones that I want to call out at the moment, and I think that they're the most important. Additionally, if you're running private cloud, there is no option for private cloud to public threat grid integration. That is not a deployment methodology that we support, so it's not there. Some of this information will be changing, and I want you to be aware that it will be changing. Please keep an eye out for the private cloud appliance. When that is released, some of this information will be changing, and some of the supported modes will be changing. So just some quick breakdown on what the hardware requirements are for the virtual appliance. So vSphere ESXi 5 or higher will need at least 8 cores, 32 gigs of RAM, a terabyte of hard drive space, and as I said, that RAID 10 on enterprise SSDs. The big key takeaway from this is, if your customer wants to run private cloud, please make sure they have the proper vSphere environment to do so, or they will run into problems. Every time I have seen a customer try to run this product on spinning disks, all they get is a laggy console that doesn't actually function, and they get failed lookups from their endpoint connectors when it goes to connect to the cloud to do disposition lookups and check for other data. The hard drive IOP requirement is a hard requirement, and without the disks to manage it properly, this product has a lot of problems. Now, we do have 2 modes of operation here. We've got an air-gap mode, and we've got a proxy mode. Now, the virtual machine air-gap mode will be deprecated. It actually has been deprecated. It is supported for legacy customers only. The hardware appliance will be getting an air-gap mode because we can pre-ship the disposition database with the hardware appliance, which makes updating that database much simpler. It's something like 40 gigabytes, 30 to 40 gigabytes of data right off the bat just to stand up a virtual appliance in air-gap mode. And you have to download that at customer site and then find a way to transfer it to the private cloud appliance. I think Eric said it was something like 15 or 20 DVDs worth of data at the end of the day. So it definitely takes a long time to stand up, and getting ahead of the update curve as updates come out weekly is extremely difficult when you're trying to incorporate that size of data store and stay on top of oncoming updates. So a little bit more about proxy versus air-gap. So in terms of an organization perimeter, we have all of our connectors, whether they be network, email, AMP for web, or the endpoint connector, and they're all going to connect to your AMP private cloud for disposition queries. Now that AMP private cloud will then proxy those disposition queries up to the AMP public cloud, which will then return it to the private cloud. Now all of those disposition queries are held in a local cache on the AMP private cloud, which means that duplicate disposition lookups will only hit that cache at the private cloud level and then bounce back down to the AMP connector on whichever product it is. Additionally, each of those products also has a local cache, so further queries for that same hash from that particular connector will only be looked up locally. Now, in an air-gapped environment, we have all those disposition queries going to the AMP private cloud. There's no internet connectivity here. Everything is only associating with whatever the local disposition database is on that private cloud. We'll also have an internet-connected update host. That update host will retrieve its updates from the AMP public cloud, download them to the local host, we'll package them up as ISO files, and then we'll ship them over to the private cloud. This is how updates are performed. Now, this is a fairly standard update methodology within an air-gapped environment, but it does lead to problems when our AMP database is as large as it is and grows as quickly as it does. Are there any questions on this before I move forward? All right, I'm not seeing anything, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into product planning. So all of that data that we gathered in stage 1, all that information that we put together and hopefully documented and have available to us, what exact, oh, Thorsten's got his hand up. What's up, Thorsten?
Mahesh, do you have a way to take Thorsten off of mute so we can take his question live?
I think I just did, actually. Go ahead, Thorsten.
Oh, you got it. Perfect. Thank you.
So, can you hear me now, Jesse?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So just a question regarding, so do we have an option, so maybe so customers allowing having one appliance connecting to the cloud for everything. So maybe the customer has email and web. Is there any option to give them a private cloud appliance, a virtual appliance, just acting as the proxy and cache for all disposition lookups?
We don't have one at the moment. The idea of just a disposition server, a disposition caching server, acting as a proxy for the local environment has been discussed. It hasn't been executed in any meaningful way. Actually, I don't think it's been tried at all. And the real reason for that is because the bandwidth requirements for these disposition lookups are so low that there really isn't a need for a caching server at that level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thorsten, you'll need to uncheck your raised hand unless you have something else you want to say. Otherwise, I don't think it disappears on its own. Okay. Okay, so a lot of these questions, hopefully we have information for. And what we can do is take that information, and one of the steps we need to take as we're looking at all of these exclusions and these application block lists and whitelists, these IP address block lists, is we need to evaluate them on relevance. Maybe they were relevant when they were set up in the customer environment, and that could have been 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe longer. Is that information still relevant to us? And if so, do I need to implement it in the way, implement it in the endpoint security product? Or should this be something I need to move to my firewall for blocking, or move to my proxy for URL blocking, or maybe to DNS for both of those?
Hello?
Hello? Is there information here that should be handled at a different level by a different product? And especially ask those questions with the limitations of AMP for Endpoints in mind. Now, for example, I want to point out that AMP for Endpoints has an IP blacklist tool. However, AMP for Endpoints does not have a built-in firewall. There is not what I would call firewall functionality built into the product. Rather, there is command and control blocking functionality. So if I have a piece of malware reaching out to a specific set of IP addresses or URLs, AMP for Endpoints can disrupt that connectivity and prevent that connection from functioning. However, if I want to, say, block Facebook.com using AMP for Endpoints, I can kind of block it. And there are limitations around how that blocking works that users are able to bypass if they want to. That is the reason why I say we need to look at this information in terms of what the current feature set is for AMP for Endpoints, as well as what other products we have in the environment that we can leverage for the same coverage. So certain things like blocking may need to move to the DNS level or the firewall level or your proxy level in order to be handled with the proper efficacy versus keeping it at the endpoint where it may have been before because it was quick and easy to throw it into that product instead.
Hey, Jesse, this is Alex.
Hey, Alex.
I just want to put in my 2 cents here and just reinforce what you're saying. And one of the challenges here is now that we're selling AMP for Endpoints to be that antivirus replacement, which we didn't do, right, till a year or so ago. One of the challenges is we're replacing these apps like McAfee and Symantec, which are honestly quite mature in their, been around a long time. So one of the challenges really is to really try to flesh out what they do today, because we get requirements like, can AMP do everything Symantec can do? It's like, well, no. What are you using Symantec for? So how many other features? What features are you using in that product? And then trying to make sure that once you get, like, say, halfway through the deployment, they go, okay, we want to block this file name. Like, oh, well, we don't block file names. We block SHAs. And that might be news to them. So, yeah, it's pretty important. And then the hard part really is understanding what that other thing is doing so you know you can bring up, like you said, up front and say, well, use the Windows firewall for that, or use, you know, some network-based control for that. So yeah, pretty big. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. I appreciate your feedback on that, and I really can't emphasize that enough, because I have seen so many customers run into that particular issue, and it can be very frustrating, both from a support side, because we have to tell the customer, no, you can't do that, and from a sales side, because you inevitably get the customer coming back and going, well, you told us it could do this, which is their misinterpretation of information, unfortunately. But it is what it is, and it's something that we need to be able to clearly tell customers when we have those discussions with them. So one of the next big pieces to this is planning out how we want to manage our groups, policies, exclusions, and which features we want to turn on within our environment. I can't emphasize enough the importance of group and policy planning within AMP for Endpoints. Do this wrong, and the customer will be suffering heartburn for years to come. Do this right, and their environment will be a cinch to manage, and they will love the product because of it. It is probably one of the most critical things, is getting this organizational structure configured and organized properly for today, and taking into account what's likely to come in the next year and the next 3 years, and how we organize that, and how we can build an organizational structure that is flexible enough to account for that. Some other items here: Tetra and ClamAV, Tetra for Windows, ClamAV for OS X and Linux. Will those features be enabled on the endpoint? And if so, do we have the hardware requirements to handle it? Are we enabling it for all endpoints, for some endpoints? Another one that I really want to call out is cognitive intelligence. This is probably the least used feature in AMP for Endpoints that will give you the biggest efficacy gain that you're likely to see. Now, for those who don't know, cognitive intelligence is one of our big network engines. What it will do is it will take the network telemetry from any proxy device in the environment, and it will put it up and run a bunch of machine learning baselining algorithms on it, and then it will do anomaly detection and a bunch of really cool other machine learning stuff that I do not understand. And it will provide alerts back to you. Now, this is great because not only does it cover endpoints that have endpoint connectors installed on them, but it will also cover your IP phones, your Wi-Fi for all of your IoT devices, your printers, your scanners, your fax machines. I hope nobody has those anymore, but I'm sure they do. And all of these other devices that have their own little miniature operating system. They're very hackable, they're very compromisable, and they can be used as launching points and command control points for malicious activity within your customer environment. This is how we get visibility into that. And that is something not a lot of other competitors can claim. We can provide that level of visibility, and we can provide alerting on it, and we can give them information regarding it, and we bring that directly back into the AMP console and provide detailed alerts that aggregate to your endpoint data where possible, and if not, we'll provide you information to go out and further research what's happening. I highly encourage customers to utilize cognitive intelligence. It will save them a lot of headache, and it will provide them a lot of detail into what's going on in their environment. And with that, it's quiz time. So I'm going to pass the ball over to Jeremy and let him kind of take over and run the quiz real quick, and then we'll dive back in.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Before we get too much into that, though, are there any questions that anyone would like answered that we can kind of call attention to?
I do want to say, guys, that so a lot of what Jesse has given us is groundwork, right, to give you a bit of insight into the kinds of things you want to make sure you're discussing with customers. We're not leaving how to do these things off the table. That's coming up a little later in the session. We're going to get into some specifics around organizational management, which knobs to tweak and tune and why and what you'll get. That's coming, but we're trying to get you guys to really understand that there's a whole body of questions that we have not done the best job historically asking customers when it comes to deployment. And because we have not done the best job, oftentimes partners have suffered the same fate. And so we want to make sure, one, we're giving you an idea of the breadth of questions you need to be asking, the types of questions, and the scope of the environment you need to understand to get a deployment done well. Answers to a lot of these things you've seen are coming up in the next couple of hours as we dig into more content. So just wanted to add that in.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, a lot of the details as far as like group planning and stuff, I know it's coming up later on in the session. I think there was a question about that in the Q&A. So if you'll check out the screen I'm sharing here, you'll see the Kahoots page. You can do this from the app, but most people don't have the app, so just direct your browser, whether we're on a mobile device or a desktop or a laptop. Just go to kahoot.it, punch in that PIN number, and put in your nickname, and I see someone has put my name in there. They'll probably tank all the answers to make me look bad. That's okay. So as soon as we get we'll give it another couple seconds here, and then we're gonna kick things off. There should be about 5 or 6 questions per Kahoot, per quiz. Most right answers, quickest right answers win the prize. We're going to see some of these questions I think have 30 seconds to answer, so be mindful of that when you read a question and read through the answers. All right, 15 players. How many more do we expect to have here? Let's see, 16. All right, we're going to close this up in about 10 seconds, so if you're not in 10, we're going to kick off. All right, we're going to kick it off now. Here we go. Question number 1. One of the most important first steps in an AMP deployment is pretty easy on this one. If everyone answers before 30 seconds is up, we'll automatically advance.
I just got to say, you know, I may have outlined it as one thing, but I'm loving the coffee. That is a personal requirement.
It is the true right answer, but
it is the true right answer. Somebody got it.
Someone got it, right. All right, so most people are on the right track here. So everyone, if you haven't participated in Kahoots before, you're probably getting the hang of it. This first quiz is more or less so we can all get familiarized with this quiz process. All right, moving on to the next question. All right, Dinky Pete, congrats. All right. SCCM, GMF, and Altiris are all examples of what? I think a couple of them would make cool band names, quite honestly.
I can't disagree.
Thank you, New York. We are Altiris.
That has a surprisingly good ring to it.
Yeah, right. All right, that was a good one. Everybody got that one. Let's move on to the next one. Let's see. Dinky Pete again. AMP Private Cloud can choose one. This one might be a little trickier. All right, most folks got that one right. Yeah, integrate with Meraki, it certainly cannot today. Support IOF, yeah, there's no clarity for private cloud, and as far as threat response goes, can't connect to the cloud, so no threat response. Next question. Dinky Pete is losing his lead to Mike Simone. All right, when deploying AMP for endpoints on Windows with Tetra enabled, you can expect, choose 2.
That's a nice tricky question.
Right? All right, there you go. Yeah, double efficacy, wouldn't that be a dream? Yeah, so it's bandwidth requirements are going to increase due to signature updates, as well as storage resource requirements are going to increase. And I think we have one more question here. Let's see, Art Vandelay coming up. All right. Not bad for an architect. A customer could organize groups by, and this is actually content from within the slide, so this might be tricky for some. All right, everyone got that one. Good deal, good deal. Okay, so
can we take 2 seconds? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. The winner was Dinky Pete with Simone coming up on second place, followed by Art Vandelay. Great name, Art Vandelay. So this is how the quizzes are going to go. We got like 4 quizzes in addition to this one we just did. We'll do them at the end of each module for this session. What were you going to say, Eric?
Yeah, so question number 4, right, it posed the question of, if you roll out Tetra, what can we expect? And there were a couple of folks that chose, I don't know if it was, intentional or jokingly, but they chose full PCI compliance. And the only reason I pause is because this is actually a question I've received 3 times over the last week from 3 different people. They may all be connected to the same customer environment, but I wanted to point out, right, that installing Tetra or installing any software package does not guarantee PCI compliance. It's not a software package that ever gets vetted and checked as compliant. It's an environment. And so if we want to make an environment PCI DSS compliant through a QSA checking the environment, there are ways to configure AMP for endpoint that can help achieve the PCI DSS requirements. But just installing Tetra alone doesn't make it fully compliant. There are a whole lot of other things that need to be done on that endpoint where you're installing AMP for endpoint. But it can help, and there is a document that you can pull down off of Sales Connect that talks about what Presidio did in validating AMP for endpoint's ability to lend towards PCI compliance. And we've been able to use it to some level of success with customers in the field. Just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point, right? And I figured that some of these questions, some of my more controversial quiz questions, would probably raise some conversations that would be good for this particular audience. Thanks, Eric. All right, Jesse, back to you.
Great. Let's see here. You'll have to pass the ball back to me.
On its way. There you go.
Okay, so I threw a 15-minute break slide in here because I wasn't sure how many questions we'd get and where we're at, but I think we might be a little bit early for a break. So I'm going to keep going through the next section, and then we'll see where we're at. All right, so console setup, options, menus, checkboxes, and lots of other buttons to press and switches to flip. So within the AMP for Endpoints console, there are some primary chunks of feature functionality that everybody should be aware of. And outbreak controls is one of those. Now, under outbreak controls, we have a large sampling of different preventative or detection engines that we can access. We've got simple custom detections, advanced custom detections, Android detections, which is just SHA-1 matching, application control for blocking and whitelisting applications, networks for black and whitelists for IP addresses, endpoint IOCs, and we're going to talk more about IOCs in the next couple of slides. So I'm not going to dive into those too much right off the bat. I do want to kind of touch on what each of these others are. So with the custom detection section, we've got simple, advanced, and Android. So simple custom detections is basically exactly what it sounds like. If you have a SHA file with a given SHA in your environment and you don't want it there, add it to your simple custom detection list by SHA 256, and AMP will quarantine that file and clean it up. Now, you can also approach files that you don't necessarily have a SHA for by writing ClamAV signatures for that file. Now, this functionality can approximate the idea of we have a file with this name in our environment that we don't want there. You can kind of do that with the ClamAV signature. It is not what I would call foolproof. It is an option. It functions much like a Tetra definition or any other signature matching AV engine, but you can write that signature to be as robust as you would like. So there is the ability to do something akin to what the customer is asking by writing these signatures. You also have Android blocking. So up to version 6 of Android is supported right now. We will see a new connector for Android at some point in the future. I can't give a date because we don't have one, but I can tell you work is ongoing to support the newest versions of Android. Currently, what we have there is SHA-1 matching. The Android OS doesn't do SHA-256s very cleanly, so we don't use that as a method for matching files on Android. Luckily, the Android ecosystem is small enough that SHA-1 is still a viable option. How long that will be the case, I can't say, but for the moment, it is. So what we can do is we can drop a SHA-1 in there, and it works the same way as simple custom detections, but for Android. Now, application blocking and whitelisting, exactly what it sounds like. You upload an executable file that you either want to allow in your environment or don't want to allow. The system will SHA that file. It'll store that file in the file repository, and it will then do comparison and take action based on either a block or a whitelist. Network IP blacklists and whitelists, as I discussed before, AMP for endpoints does not have a firewall. This is specifically for command and control. Now, Cisco maintains a very consistently updated list of command and control servers on the internet and IP addresses and URLs on the internet that we use as a data feed. We get that feed from ThreatGrid and from Umbrella, and we use that as a means of disrupting orchestrated malware attacks. Now, this is pretty effective for what it does. However, it does not perform true firewall-style blocking. There is no packet filtering involved. There's a simple check for destination and source involved here. There is no long-term blocking involved. You can bypass this engine with a little bit of effort. So please don't position this feature as a firewall when talking to customers. Now, indicators of compromise is a very confusing topic for most people. One of my first presentations just after I got hired was to explain the difference between endpoint IOCs and cloud IOCs. And at the time, I took about 10 slides to do this in about half an hour. I think I can do it pretty concisely now in one slide. Endpoint IOCs. You take a signature file from openioc.com or org or whatever it is, and you install that IOC file on your AMP for Endpoints console. That IOC file can then be assigned to a group of endpoints, and that scan will run on those endpoints. Now, there's a couple of key things to be aware of when running endpoint IOC scans. It's extremely resource intensive. It will use 90+% of all system resources during the IOC scan. Once that scan is complete, it creates an index file of all files and the structure of the operating system, and that IOC file or that file is what the IOC itself is run against. So you get an archive file, and then you get to run your IOCs against it. Now, once that archiving process is complete, you can run and update your IOC lists as often as you like, but you do need to update that regularly in order to be consistent with what is currently on the endpoint. Now, this is typically used for incident response to go back and clean up file fragments and remaining malware from an attack campaign that's been detected and thwarted by the incident response team. That is the typical use case for endpoint IOCs. Now, we have the other side of the house. We have cloud-managed IOCs. These IOCs are written by the Talos team and by the ThreatGrid research and efficacy team. They are managed and maintained entirely by Cisco. Customers do not currently get insight into exactly what is causing these IOCs to trigger. I have put in feature requests for that, and so far they have not been taken up as a primary leading item for customers. So if a customer sees one of these cloud-based IOCs flag and they're getting alerts on it and they need to know what exactly is triggering that IOC, they're going to have to raise a support ticket right now. Now, these IOCs will generate alerts. You'll see them come in as events. They'll show up on your dashboard, and you will have the option to take action on them, or if you know what's flagging it, you can ignore it. They do not require any configuration from the user, and they do not consume any endpoint resources. These function by taking the endpoint telemetry that we gather as a part of normal operations and running IOC scans against that telemetry data. Now, the downside to this style of IOC is if you have a file that is non-active on an endpoint, either a file fragment, a registry key, or something else that is just sitting dormant on the endpoint, we will not see it and we will not flag it as part of an IOC. AMP4Endpoints manages to gather endpoint telemetry by looking at active data connections on the network, by looking at file move, copy, and execute operations, and by looking at what is happening to protected applications in memory. Dormant applications, dormant files on the operating system are not scanned and action is not taken on them unless it's through a retrospective action. And that retrospection only works for 7 days after that file gets on the endpoint. So, for example, if you have a file come in, it's a piece of malware that we don't know about. It gets to the endpoint and it executes. That malware creates a bunch of files and then shuts down. We come back and we clean up that malware. If those files have been there for longer than 7 days, then those files will stay in place on the endpoint until they're accessed next time. When they're accessed during the next go around, AMP will then re-query that file and will clean up that malware. However, any of those additional files that were created will remain on the endpoint in a dormant state and will not be detected. Okay? They are, however, either not malicious or were not detected at the time by our scanning engines. Next time they are executed, if they are an executable, they will be scanned, they may be sandboxed, and the disposition may change, which will result in a cleanup. Now that process of upload, sandbox, and disposition change can take, once the file is uploaded, which is the big variable here, once it hits the AMP repository, it takes approximately 7 minutes for that file to be sandboxed and for the disposition change to occur. Okay, so that's the key piece right there. That's how our back end functions and the timing on it. As far as the file upload, it really is dependent on customer bandwidth. Okay, exclusion lists. We've seen some pretty cool changes in our exclusions in the last few months. I believe it was November when Cisco released the Cisco maintained exclusion lists. When our development got around to putting those out, it was a huge boon to us. We have for years maintained a TechZone article with lists of all known exclusions to maintain application compatibility. Now we have all of those lists built straight into the console. This is quick and easy for customers to access. They can go in. If they have known applications, they can simply select those exclusion lists and add them to their policy. It's clean, it's simple, and we will continually update those maintained exclusion lists. Now, we have custom exclusion lists that you can create for Windows, Mac, and Linux. I do not know of exclusion lists for Android, and we will probably not see exclusion lists for Clarity for iOS because we cannot take action on iOS file systems. We can monitor those file systems, but we cannot take action on it. Okay, so what is the purpose of exclusions? And I'm thinking you probably all know this, but just to recap, it allows us to coexist with other security tools. So we're not scanning their quarantine repositories, we're not scanning their file processes, and they're not scanning ours, right? This is what we do to reduce performance overhead. This is what we do to bring application compliance and compatibility into line. So for example, if I'm running a compiler and I'm building software, I really don't want to be performing file system scans using AMP for Endpoints or any security product on the directories or the applications that I'm using for compiling that software. Why? Because compilers are extremely sensitive to timing. We've got a question. Don't mute me. All right, please, go ahead. What can I do for you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so question on the exclusion list. So in a policy, when I go into the exclusions, what is the meaning of if one of the exclusions is color-coded or where the red or the X box is, if it's color-coded like orange? I'm seeing that in one of my deployments, and the rest of the exclusions are just like white on the X box.
I'm not sure. I haven't seen that before. Yeah, that's a really good question. If they made a UI change around that, I'm not aware of it. I suspect what it could be is that the exclusion list, you're talking about a Cisco maintained list, correct?
Yeah, it's Cisco maintained, and the customer has also added a custom exclusion list in addition to the Cisco ones. And this one actually is flagging the Windows default exclusion list as a orange X under the Cisco maintained exclusion list. So I could send a screenshot to show you. I've never seen that before.
Yeah, please do. Shoot me a screenshot. I want to take a good look at that because if there's a UI change there that I'm not aware of, I need to find out what it is. And I'm a little curious myself. I have a sneaking suspicion that I know what it is, but I want to validate before I go speaking out of turn on it. So please shoot me that screenshot, and I will find out and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Again, you'll need to click your raised hand button to make it go away. Does anybody else have any questions while we're paused here? Thorsten, I see a question mark next to your name. I'm not sure if you're trying to ask a question or if that's something else. Okay. So let's see. Exclusions. Right. All right. I think we're ready for the next slide here. So let's move on. So we have several different types of exclusions. We've got thread exclusions, path exclusions, file exclusions, wildcard exclusions, and then we got a couple of different types of process exclusions. And yet, there's more. We do not have listed here exclusions that are not accessible to the customer. Currently, you cannot create exclusions for the exploit prevention engine or the malicious activity prevention engine directly from the console. There is ongoing work to provide a method for doing that, but currently your best option for those types of exclusions, if you encounter issues, is actually to raise a support ticket. Unfortunately, that's a complicated path, and it's not one that I like, but it is the one that we have at the moment. So if you encounter an issue where you need to exclude a given process from exploit prevention, or you need to exclude a given set of executables from malicious activity prevention, from exploit prevention, then you'll need to raise a support case. They'll escalate it to Tier 3 support for that type of work, and those guys will sit down. They're very, very good at it. It usually doesn't take them but 1 or 2 diagnostics from you and some information to identify exactly what needs to be excluded, and they will add those exclusions to the console for you. You will not be able to see them, unfortunately, but once they're there, the connectors will download that information via policy the same as they do anything else, and you'll see that function quite nicely. Go ahead, Thorsten.
Yes, regarding the Cisco maintained exclusion list.
Yes.
And the orange cross. So when we introduce the maintained exclusion list, the Windows exclusions have been assigned to any policy by default, and you were not able to disable the default exclusion list. And now they did a change in the UI, and now you can disable the Cisco maintained exclusion list. That's the difference, and therefore it's marked orange.
I see. Okay. So let me make sure I understand this correctly. The default exclusion policy that we apply to Windows endpoints, at one point we did not allow it to be disabled, and now we can, but that yellow box is a warning not to unless you're really sure you want to.
Yes, you're right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Learn something every day. Okay, so if you have questions about the exclusion setup and how each piece of those work, there used to be appendices slides associated with this slide deck. There's not anymore. However, I do have an associated slide deck that is actually built into the help docs on the console for each of these types of exclusions that will outline exactly how they're to be structured, when to use, for example, wildcards, and will outline things like you cannot mix and match file extensions and wildcards and have them function properly, or paths and wildcards and have them function properly. If you put a path exclusion down with a wildcard in it, it will not actually function. It skips over that exclusion because it can't parse it properly. If you use a wildcard at all, it has to be labeled as a type wildcard exclusion. So with that in mind, let's move on to the next section. Policies, recommended policies. So when you first set up AMP for endpoints and you're configuring your console, you're provided with a series of policies. Now the screenshot I have here is Windows-only policies, and they're the ones I want to talk about primarily because they more or less set the stage for how the policies for other products should be configured. So if you have Android, Mac, Linux, and so forth, you can configure each of their policies based on their specific settings within those policies. But I'm more interested right now in the organization of these policies. So by default, we get audit, domain controller, protect, server, and triage policies. These come pre-populated in the console. They're configured to be as lightweight as possible. They're designed to provide maximum security with the least performance impact. So there is a compromise taking place there. As is true with any policy that we create, we're going to have to decide on compromises. Now, all of these policies are set up with a specific purpose in mind. The audit policy does not turn on active scanning or blocking. It provides no protection, but it does provide a lot of insight into the file telemetry and the system activity on that endpoint. Domain controller policy is exactly what it sounds like. It's a policy designed for Active Directory domain controllers. Our protect policy is our standard endpoint protection policy. This covers exactly what you'd think it covers. Any endpoint, we turn on the engines we think are appropriate, and we leave turned off anything that we think is going to cause a performance impact that'll negatively affect a user's experience on that endpoint. Our server policy is kind of a catch-all. This policy is designed for Windows servers, whether it be a file server, an IIS server, or so forth. Now, when you go to apply this policy, be careful. This policy you're probably going to want to use as a kind of a template to clone it and then configure it for IIS or Exchange or DNS or SQL. Whatever server role that you have, you're going to want to clone the server policy and then modify it to fit that specific server use case. And then our triage policy, this one is, hey, we had a bunch of endpoints get infected, let's throw them in the triage policy. We don't care about performance in this policy. This policy is all about, hey, we got stuff happening, we got to block it, right? So let's take a minute, let's approach those endpoints from a different security posture, and let's make sure that whatever's going on, we're addressing it with every tool at our disposal. All right, best practices for how we create policies. If you look closely at this slide, you'll notice I've got a lot of duplicates here, but they're not actually duplicates. I've got an audit policy. That audit policy has another debug policy, which is a clone of its parent. And then I have an upgrade policy, which is a clone of the audit policy parent as well. The difference with these two policies is one has debugging enabled and one has the upgrades configured within it. The same is true for domain controllers and protect. And it would be true for the other policies if I could get them on the screen, but I couldn't and still keep it readable. Now, why would we do this? I promise this will make sense to you when we get to groups. It's coming up very quickly. But keep in mind, this is the recommended policy configuration. And I promise there's a methodology that will make perfect sense in a couple of slides. So just bear with me on this, and we'll get there. Now, what we want to do is we want to take these policies, and we want to use them for our parent groups, and we're going to use them for parent groups and put our connectors in child groups. By doing this, we can manage our endpoints in a nice, granular fashion. We can debug smaller groups when needed to identify localized issues within the environment. We can upgrade across our environment in a very staged, methodical, planned out way without affecting our actual security posture, but while still getting the updates that we need onto those endpoints. Now, I do want to point out here that fewer policies is better within reason. This seems like it creates a lot of policies, but honestly, this is actually fairly minimal compared to what I see in a lot of customer environments. You get 5,000 or 10,000 endpoints, and you start having 20 or 30 different departments, and the next thing you know, you've got 50 or 60 policies, and things get kind of messy kind of quick. Even though most of those policies have the exact same settings in them, customers love to create a policy for every group and every organization within their overall corporate structure, and the next thing you know, you can't really manage it because you can't roll out changes in an effective way. Okay, policy settings. Here's how we control connector behavior. Best practice, I like to tell people, utilize what we've given to you. Each of the policies are pre-configured with settings that make sense for that policy. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go in and customize the policy based on your organizational needs or based on the customer's organizational security posture. But be aware that you should start with the template that is provided to you for that purpose and then modify based on that, okay? So each of these templates is designed to provide that nice balance between performance and security while maintaining both to the best of our ability. Now, we provide this nice little recommended settings box here specifically to kind of give guidance as to how things should be done. there are some instances that I want to call out, specifically Windows servers. There was a point in time where we told people, do not install our network driver, also called Device Flow Correlation, or DFC, on Windows servers. Do not install Tetra on Windows servers. These were recommendations that we had in our documentation. These recommendations no longer hold true, with specific exceptions. Now, the key thing here is not necessarily what we want to turn on or off, because we will evaluate that on a per role basis, but specifically that even if you install a connector with the network driver with DFC disabled, if you do not use the install flag to disable that driver, the driver will still install. Now, if you install a network driver on a server that is hosting a SQL server, and those SQL transactions are highly sensitive, you're going to see problems. You're going to create a latency within the network loop that is going to slow things down, and customers are not going to be happy. We're going to hear a lot about heartburn here. This is causing problems. This thing's not working right. We've tuned, we've excluded. It doesn't seem to fix anything. Why? They deployed with the network driver disabled, but they didn't prevent it from being installed. That will still impact performance, and it still needs to be addressed. So be aware when deploying to sensitive environments, such as server environments for Exchange, SQL, Active Directory, etc. Depending on the server role, you may need to turn off the DFC. You may want to turn off Tetra to prevent performance impacts on the file system, but you'll need to turn off DFC for those server roles in order to prevent network latency issues, which will lead to heartburn down the road. And to do that, you need to use the switches. So keep that in mind. You'll see this called out again and again in these slides as we move forward. Now, there is a setting in here to enable connector protection. Connector protection prevents our users from modifying or disabling the endpoint service on that endpoint. I highly recommend customers activate this feature. However, be aware, if they activate this feature, or preferably when they activate this feature, we cannot decode their password. If they lose that password, they're going to have a real bad time. We can remove that password on the back end, but it's not an easy process, and it will cause heartburn. Best practice, get that password. Either lock it in a digital file password locker somewhere, print it out, take it and stick it in a locked filing cabinet only accessible to the people that should have it. Find some way to safely store that password so that no one can get to it except authorized users that need it, to ensure that it does not get lost. This is also true when generating API keys. Once you get that key, you'll never see it again. Make sure you store it somewhere safe. Get it printed out, locked in that file cabinet. Get it stored in a digital password locker and put somewhere safe. Please, please protect your keys. So there's some critical policy settings that I definitely want you to be aware of. Now, we've got conviction modes. For non-audit policies, there is usually no reason not to enable these. So turn on quarantine, turn on block, enable system protection. Our detection engines. For workstation policies, you want to enable Tetra if you're replacing a traditional AV scanning engine. So if they've got Symantec on there, turn off Tetra. There's no reason to have both, and they will cause problems with each other by fighting. If you are, for example, running a compiler and building a software package, you probably don't want to run exploit prevention. It may cause compatibility issues. There are other instances where that is the case as well. So here's how we turn that on and off. Couple other critical policy settings. Please don't change these. They're accessible via policy, but you shouldn't mess with them unless you've discussed it with support and you're actually intending to accept the performance impact that these could incur. On execute mode. This mode holds all file executions. It will grab that file handle when the user double clicks it and it will hold on to it until until the AMP connector gets a disposition return from the cloud servers. Now, that round trip averages 200 milliseconds, but to the user, 200 milliseconds is 4 or 5 seconds delay. It feels like that to them, but it actually isn't. If you turn on this mode, every application on their Windows file system will feel very sluggish. Every time that process executes, it will hold that file process and wait for that disposition lookup. And any child processes that it needs will get held until they also get looked up, and so forth. This particular policy setting has a huge impact on endpoint performance. It's left disabled unless you absolutely need it for some reason. This is the type of policy setting that should only be enabled in a triage policy, and even then, I would question its efficacy and need in that particular environment use case. There are situations, I've seen 3-letter organizations, for example, that like to turn this on. They don't care about the performance impact. They tell their users, deal with it. We don't care what your problem is. Security is #1 concern to them, so they activate this. But it's very rare that people want to use this feature. So leave it set to passive unless that performance impact is acceptable to the customer. Now, we also have cache settings. These will handle the unknown, clean, and malicious caches on the endpoint. Now, each of these has a defined TTL, and they're defined that way to prevent excessive lookups and bandwidth utilization for those lookups. So unless you've talked to Cisco support and they have given you a reason to modify the cache settings, please do not change these settings. It impacts both our cloud infrastructure and it impacts the bandwidth usage for the customer. It can also cause other negative performance impacts on that endpoint, so it's highly recommended not to change these settings. Okay, so we talked about policies, we talked about policy settings. Now let's take a minute and I want to talk about groups. Much like our policies, we have identical groups that map to the existing parent policies when we create a new AMP for Endpoint Console. So when you log in, these are the groups that you'll see. They map directly on a one-to-one basis with the policies that you see within AMP for Endpoints. Excuse me, I need some water. Okay, so when we create the new group configuration, or excuse me, when we create our new sets of policies, we want to set up a structure whereby we can manage endpoints effectively. So if we have an accounting department, if we have a manufacturing department, if we have an accounts receivable or a shipping department, we want to have each of those departments segregated out nicely so we can tell what's what when we go into the console, right? But that doesn't mean that each of those departments necessarily needs a different policy configuration with a different group configuration, and then audit and debug groups associated with each of those and policies associated with each of those groups. This is where we get into problems with excessive group and policy creation. Rather, what we want to do is we want to create some primary parent policies, our audit, debug, and upgrade policies associated with our audit, debug, and upgrade groups. And then we want to create child groups for each department. So if I can stick accounts receivable or my accounting department, my manufacturing department, and my shipping department into child groups, then I can orchestrate how those child groups function in a very granular way. And I can do that by simply moving child groups between different policies. If I want to upgrade just my manufacturing floor, I can do that. And then I can keep the policy consistent while I do that, with the exception of the upgrade window. If I am having issues in my accounting department with my accounting software, and I need to find out what's going on there. I don't want to turn on debug for accounting and manufacturing and my shipping department. I want to turn on debug just for accounting, gather data from there, and determine what the cause is. I don't want to affect my overall organization and its security posture while I'm trying to sort out what's happening in one place. So what we want to do is we want to orchestrate child groups. We want to take and put each of those groups into, or each of those organizational structures into a child group, and we want to associate it with a parent group. In this example, I have family and friends as one group because I have a lot of family and I have a lot of friends, and I put their connectors into these two different categories. Connectors that I have at home for myself, my family, my roommates. I put their endpoint connectors into this group, and then if I have family that doesn't live close by or doesn't live in the same house with me, then I put their connectors into remote connectors. But they're both under the family and friends child group. When I need to perform an upgrade, I simply pull the child group and I move it under the parent group. Now I have them in the upgrade group. Now, over a period of time, all of those connectors will get their upgrades, but their security posture hasn't changed. I haven't modified their exclusions or the engine settings. I haven't changed what whitelists or blacklists they're associated with. All of these settings are consistent across both groups. And when I'm done, or when I check my computer's page and all of those systems have updated, I can simply move them back to the parent page. Now in this way, I can manage which organizational structures in what regions or what job roles or what have you, any organizational structure I want to use, I can keep their policies consistent, I can upgrade them, I can move them back. I can upgrade the next group and move it back. I can do phased rollouts based on those organizational structures simply by modifying the parent group associated with a child group. Very simple to manage, very granular, and very functional without creating a lot of new policy duplicates, without creating a lot of policy and group spam for one-off use cases. So when we talk about our policies and we talk about the engines on our endpoints, we talk about Tetra. Tetra is our signature matching engine. It's our AV, right? A lot of you know probably what the back end for this is. I'm not allowed to say, so I'm not going to, but it's public knowledge, so if you want to look it up, go for it. What we have is the Tetra update server or the AMP update server. Don't get it confused. They're both the same thing, and unlike what I would consider that name to suggest, it only handles Tetra definition. It does not handle connector updates at this time. If you would like to see that, please, send a support request or a feature request up the chain, and we'll get it put on the spreadsheet. The more people want it, the sooner it'll get built. I've heard that request before. I know it's there. It hasn't gotten picked up yet. Just my 2 cents and a push to please submit feature requests on this issue. Anyway, the AMP update server stores copies of the local Tetra definitions. So if I have 5,000 endpoints in a couple of office buildings and they're all connected together on one big LAN, I don't necessarily want all of those endpoints constantly reaching out to the AMP servers for Tetra definition files. This causes gateway bandwidth issues, it causes latency and overhead that you don't want to deal with on your network, and it generally slows things down. It's not a great approach to this issue. So we provide the AMP update or Tetra update server. The server runs on IIS, Apache, and Nginx. It's pretty easy to configure. There's lots of documentation out there, and if you have issues, reach out to me or reach out to the BU escalations team, the Tier 3 support team. They'll be happy to help you get it configured. This hosts copies of the local Tetra definitions and prevents your endpoints from reaching outside your network. So your external WAN bandwidth requirements drop to a negligible value immediately. The speed at which your endpoints can obtain updates increases in step in step with that, as we don't have to worry about causing bandwidth issues and QoS problems with getting those files. This can be configured on a per policy basis. So if you have roaming endpoints and they're out on public Wi-Fi, or they're at home, or they're traveling abroad, maybe they're on an airplane, they can still reach out to the AMP cloud and download those Tetra updates. You can also put this in a DMZ and have those endpoints that are working remote reach out to your DMZ and grab the updates from there. I don't see the benefit in that personally, since it's hosting the exact same file set that we would have in the cloud, but if that is a use case that your customer has, they can do that. So there's a few options for the connector download. There's a bootstrapper option, there is the redistributable option, and then there's the URL option. Keep in mind, and I get this question all the time, there is no MSI package for AMP for endpoints. We will not be providing an MSI package in the future. It has been deemed a hard no from development due to the implementation costs involved in getting MSI packages automatically built on what is, for all intents and purposes, an entirely Linux backend. If your customer needs an MSI package, if they want to do group policy deployments directly, they can build one themselves. We have documentation for it. Support will not help them with this. TAC will not help them. Escalations will not help them. If they want to do this, we will provide them the documentation, wash our hands of it, and walk away. That is all support will do for you. But you're more than welcome to do it, and I know many Windows administrators who are very comfortable with that process and are very capable of doing it. I wrote the documentation for how to do this. It's not very difficult to do if you follow the documentation step by step. Now, when using SDCM, when using Altiris, when using SolarWinds, when using any deployment methodology other than send an email to my user, turn on this little checkbox for redistributable. If you do not, your package will be very small to download, which looks nice, but when you run that package, that connector is going to reach out to the AMP cloud and download the rest of its data, which is 30 to 40 megabytes per endpoint. It is not recommended that you deploy using any primary deployment mechanism without enabling the redistributable and downloading the entire install package at one time. Now, if your customer has decided that they want to use Tetra and they're deploying to a large number of endpoints, please deploy the Tetra update server prior to deploying to your endpoints. It's staged in this order on the slides for a reason. If you deploy an endpoint connector with Tetra enabled, as soon as that connector reaches out to the cloud, it is going to start downloading 500 plus megabytes of signature definition files to that endpoint at that time. If you do not have the Tetra update server in place prior to deployment, you will end up DOSing your network, especially if you're deploying to 5,000 endpoints at one time without checking what your bandwidth availability is. I have seen this happen several times with several different customers. Please use the update server. It will save the customer a whole lot of hassle and a whole lot of headache, and it makes support's life a whole lot easier. Use the connector redistributable. Again, we're not going to impact their WAN and their bandwidth availability if we use the redistributable. Use the two together, and you have the lowest bandwidth impact install that you can get with AMP for endpoints, and it is actually extremely low bandwidth if you install with both features. Now, I have my little call out here. Use switches to prevent drivers from being installed. Disabling features within the policy will not prevent that driver from being installed. Additionally, the converse of that is true. If you decided that you didn't want DFC when you installed, you didn't want the network driver, and then you wanted you cannot install it by simply turning on the feature in policy. You will require a reinstall of that endpoint connector. This behavior may change in the future, but this is how it functions at this point in time. All right, Windows servers. Windows servers tend to be very sensitive. A lot of them run critical business applications, whether that be your air conditioning, whether that be your point-of-sale systems backend, a SQL server of some kind, maybe your online e-commerce system, your email, your Active Directory environment, SCCM itself. Windows servers host a lot of very sensitive applications, and they can be a mite bit touchy. So, if your server hosts an application that requires a lot of network activity with a lot of time sensitivity to it, disable the network driver, DFC. You can do that with the /skipdfc1 switch. The switches are documented in the user guide. Please use that switch. Now, SMB, SQL, and Exchange, you probably don't want to run that driver. Now, running Tetra on a server is not a problem. It simply requires the proper exclusions and the proper amount of tuning to be done to do it properly, to make it work without causing issues. I don't have an issue tuning this, and we provide tools for customers to tune this. But if there is a testing environment within the customer environment, please have them deploy to that testing environment and get this validated before they deploy to production. I hope our customers have testing environments. I know some of our big customers do. I know a lot of them also don't. And it is somewhat painful when I run into a 50,000 endpoint customer that doesn't have a testing environment. So please be aware that this can be done, and it can be designed to function just fine, but you will need to use the proper switches, and you will need to create the proper exclusions. And exclusions are almost always specific to customer environments. Now, we provide some default exclusions, and they're very good for what they are. They will help with specific server roles, but you still need to tune that connector to make sure that we create the lowest performance impact possible on servers. As the bread and butter of every organization, we need to make sure that we do this part properly every time. And with that, it is time for another quiz, and then we will get into the actual deployment stages. So let me pass this back over to Jeremy, and I'll let him take over for a minute and give my voice a rest.
All right. Shall we play a game? Let me get the right app shared here. All right, you should be seeing it about now. I'll know if you can see it when people start logging in. There we go. Give everybody a few seconds to get entered into the game. Art Vandelay 2. Excellent. Kramer. Okay, we're at 20 players. We'll give everybody 10 more seconds to get logged in. Okay. Here we go. We got 5 questions coming up. 30 seconds per question. We've got a couple more coming in. Let's see. All right, we're going to kick things off. Let's go. First question. Choose all that apply for endpoint IOCs. This is endpoint IOCs. Ten seconds. All right. Yeah, every one of these is true for endpoint IOCs. Supports OpenIOC. They can be shared, and they will bring the machine to its knees if you run them. And it's best used for instant response when you know what you're hunting for. Next question. Exclusions can help us. Choose two of these. Everyone should get this one right. All right. Yep, coexist with other security tools and reduce the performance overhead. That is the two correct answers on that. Next question. When creating policies, yes, you should create a debug and diagnostic policy, and the fewer policies, the better, right? Scrib is still at the lead. Art Vandelay 2 coming up from second place. Here we go. The Tetra Update server. Choose three on this one. You guys are pretty fast. A couple more answers and we'll be done. All right, looks good. Yep, I've never seen any kind of requirement as far as the interface. This is the final question right here. This is your chance, Art Vandelay 2. When deploying on Windows servers, this is a choose three as well. Ten seconds. Okay, yeah, so a word about active mode on this one. As Jesse mentioned, you probably don't ever want to have on execute mode set to active. It should always be set to passive. It's passive by default. It will cause everything to run extremely slow on a machine, and it is not recommended. All right. Looks like Scrib won it with second place Art Vandelay and then Derp in third. All right, till the next quiz. Back to Jesse, as soon as I can pass you the ball.
So we're at about an hour 40 minutes in. I think this is probably a really good time for us to take a 10 or 15 minute break and let everybody you know, grab something to drink and take that bio break if you need to. So let's resume at the top of the hour at 9 o'clock, and we'll carry on from there. Now, I want to encourage everybody to stick around. We will be talking more about deployment methodology moving forward rather than just settings. So please hang out and stick with us. I know it's a long session, but you know, go grab some coffee to help yourself stay awake, and we'll really get into the nitty-gritty of the methodology behind our deployment strategy moving forward in a few minutes. Just a little music to keep you guys entertained while we're on our break. let's see if we can get things rolling again. Thank you all for sticking around. I see that we still have 39 attendees, so awesome. I think we only had like 42 when we started, so you guys are doing great. Everybody's sticking with us. Thank you very much for staying here and listening to me drone on. Let's get the screen share going, and we'll kick things off with stage 4 alpha deployments. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. There was a question asked by Alex earlier about the update server and how that works when configured in an environment that has remote workers. So when using the AMP update server or the Tetra update server, once again, they're both the same thing, but when using that in an environment that has remote workers that are constantly moving around and traveling, you have 2 options to set this up. One, you can create a new group and policy that works for those remote workers, and you can assign it to that, you can move those workers into that specific group so that it does not have an update server configured for it. Or alternatively, you can configure the update server in your DMZ and allow inbound traffic to that update server for your remote workers. Either methodology works. My recommendation is that you do not use the update server for your remote workers. You just leave that setting disabled for their policy, and you allow them to reach out to the AMP cloud to get those updates. Since the bandwidth overhead for remote workers is minimal, and since our goal is to avoid traffic coming and going over the WAN, I see that as the best practice there. So I hope that answers that question, and I hope I was clear in doing it. So our alpha deployment is, of course, our first endpoint connectors to be deployed, as well as our first connectors to report back and start providing file telemetry data and endpoint information. How do we make this work? Well, the first thing is we need to configure our proxy or our firewall. As I said earlier, large environments almost always have proxy, even if their endpoint team does not know that they have a proxy. Highly recommend that they investigate that and make sure that they are well aware of whatever proxy they do or don't have prior to even trying a deployment. You will need egress firewall rules. There is a wonderful document that is linked to in our best practices and our user guide that will outline exactly what URLs or IP blocks that you want to whitelist. AMP traffic is not compatible with deep packet inspection or SSL decryption. If your customer is utilizing those features on their proxy or their firewall, they will need to bypass AMP traffic for those features. Exclude it, bypass it, however they want to go about doing it, those features will invalidate AMP traffic, and instead of the server answering requests, the server will look at it as malicious traffic and just drop it. So be aware if you're having connectivity issues, that is one place that you really want to take a close look at because it's very likely that you're running into that issue. Additionally, on the endpoint connector, if you go into C program files, Cisco AMP directory, there is a tool called the connectivity tool. It's in a directory there. If you open that tool up and run it, you will get a text document output of the AMP connector trying to reach each of the required servers and whether or not you get a success, fail, or what HTTP message is being returned for that attempted connection. So if you have connectivity issues, that's your first stop right there, is go run that tool, and it's pretty quick and easy to go tell the customer, I can get to all of these updates or all of these required servers except this one. Someone messed up the exclusion or the firewall rule or what have you for this particular connection. So go take a look at that. cognitive intelligence. If they have a proxy in their environment, highly likely that they do, and that proxy can export logs in W3C format, which is a pretty standard format. Go ahead and have them set up cognitive intelligence integration prior to deploying the endpoint connectors. This helps us get a baseline for how their network functions. It ensures that as we deploy, if we start seeing malicious traffic during that initial deployment phase, that we can start addressing it, and it starts getting us alerts into the AMP for Endpoints console faster. So, biggest efficacy gain that you can get outside of installing and properly configuring your endpoint connectors is cognitive intelligence. It comes with AMP. It's a free add-on that you can use with your purchase of AMP for Endpoints. Please have your customers set up and enable this feature. All right, so we've got all our buttons clicked, our policies configured, our groups defined. We've set up a CCM or whatever deployment mechanism is with our connector redistributables so that once we click the install button, things will go smoothly. We're not downloading huge setups. We've configured the Tetra server so that when those installs happen and they start downloading 500 or 600 megabytes of signature files, we already have those files available locally on the LAN, and they're ready to hand over to the endpoints. We're ready to go ahead and start deploying. We need to pick an alpha target environment. What endpoints should we be deploying onto? Which endpoints can most absorb audit system behavior for a little while? Which endpoints are easiest for us to remediate? Which endpoints give us a reasonable sample of our overall organization? Is there a test environment? And if so, I'm deploying to that because it's a test environment. I want to know what's going on in there, and I want to tune for it. I want to have a reasonable percentage of my endpoints so that I can say that my sample size is relevant to my overall organization. What is my relevant statistical sample size for this org? That is a good question to ask, and it's one that you should take into mind when helping a customer define their target environment. My personal preference, of course, is deploy to your IT users and your technical staff. These folks have the tools and the knowledge to help diagnose and troubleshoot problems that they run into, and while they may not be happy about doing so, deploying to these folks is also not affecting your, generally speaking, is not going to affect your organization's broad security posture. So you can get it deployed to them, we can rapidly tune and streamline connector behavior for that group, and then we can move out from there. We can do the same thing in our test environment and move out from there. So, defining target alpha environment is very important, and it's something that customers need to be very careful about doing because we really want to make a good positive impact wherever possible. If we can define a good sample size and we can get it cleaned up and functioning properly for that group initially in a very short period of time, customers have a good impression. They're happy about this. They go, okay, we can make this work, and they feel better about the whole process moving forward. Now, when we deploy, we want to deploy our connectors in audit mode. Initially, we want to grab file system activity. We want to perform tuning. We want to get it set up and configured properly for that environment before we turn on any protective engines, right? We don't want to break something. We just want to see what's happening, get that telemetry, and start tuning based on that telemetry. So we want our audit-only policy, and we want it in debug, right? If you've configured based on the recommended policy and group configurations, then you should already have this. It should be a simple matter of download the connector for my audit debug policy, right? Hand our deployment package, our audit debug deployment package, over to our deployment team, or pass it over to SCCM, or IBM BigFix, or Altiris, or whatever deployment method you're using, and we start deploying there. We don't want to use the redistributable for large-scale deployments, but if you have remote workers and you don't have the ability to easily deploy to those, then you can always email a distribution link directly to your customer or directly to those users and have them click the link, download and install the connector themselves. The link will cause them to download directly from the AMP backend, not from the customer environment. So all in all, this works pretty well. The IBM BigFix deployment integration is a reasonably new one. We just finalized this a week or two ago, and it will be supported moving forward. We don't have a ton of documentation on it at this time. They're working on building it. We should see fleshed out documents sometime in the next month or so. I want to call this one out because it is important. As of macOS Mojave or OS X Mojave, whatever you want to call it, it is highly recommended to do an MDM deployment. Now, the reason for this is because in Mojave, Apple introduced a new security posture policy for full disk access. This policy, this security feature can be adjusted for AMP for endpoints by deploying a security policy using an MDM. Meraki provides an MDM. There's several free ones on the market. But without that MDM in place, pushing a security policy to the endpoint, you will not have a good deployment experience, primarily because each and every endpoint will require the user to go into the system settings and enable full disk access for AMP for endpoints. Now, if it's a few users, 2, 3, 4, not a big deal. If it's a few hundred, it's a huge problem, right? So an MDM is highly recommended, and you'll want that MDM to deploy a security policy that enables full disk access for AMP for endpoints. Now note, you can install AMP for endpoints without full disk access. However, it will not function properly and does not provide system protection at the level that we have designed it for without full disk access. Cisco Security Connector is another MDM item. You'll want to use an MDM to deploy this to iOS devices, whether that be iPads or iPhones. You'll need that device in supervised mode, and this will provide insight for admin users as to the network activity via any app over any port or protocol. Now, we've got a question from Adrian. 1 second, let me get your mic off mute here. Okay, Adrian, what can I answer for you?
You mentioned Mojave and AMP for endpoints full disk access. Actually,
yes.
I upgraded to Mojave. AMP was installed previously. Where I can check if AMP still has full disk access, or where we can check this?
Let me show you rather than tell you, because I'm not very good at telling. So if we go up to our little apple up here and we go to System Preferences.
Yeah.
I believe it's under Profiles. Let me see what comes up when I click the Profile button. No, not Profiles. Where is it? Yes, Privacy, full disk access, AMP daemon.
Got it, thanks.
Yep. Alrighty, let me put this back in presentation mode. And, okay, so yes, please use an MDM for deployment to these devices. It's really the only way to deploy to iOS and to iPads and iPhones. This will give you the Cisco Umbrella and Cisco Clarity modules. Now, the modules work more or less as seen here. You'll have the Umbrella module connecting to the Umbrella portion of the cloud as an app extension on your phone, and you'll have the AMP Clarity module reaching out to the AMP cloud and providing information in the AMP for endpoints dashboard. Again, Meraki is a great product for this, and it's a nice, easy way to upsell. Their firewalls are not horribly expensive, nor is the licensing horribly expensive when looked at in a broad enterprise level kind of environment. Okay, so we want to deploy to our alpha environment or our alpha group. We're going to deploy in audit and debug. We're going to monitor our console to make sure that our deployments are functioning properly and that we're getting data back. We'll look for installations and registrations, and our console should start populating pretty quickly. Now, once our endpoints are deployed, we're deploying in audit and debug, so from the moment they're installed on the endpoint, they're going to start collecting endpoint telemetry data. They're going to report it back to the cloud, and they're going to populate that data in a file on the endpoint called sfc.exe.log. That file is gold in terms of tuning. That is where most of our data for tuning comes from, as well as most of our diagnostic data. We'll want to let that endpoint run for a minimum of 30 minutes. And then we can use the remote diagnostic feature to gather that data, and then we'll download that data from the AMP4Endpoints file repository. There's a slide at the very end of the deck that takes you step by step where to click for each of these items. And then we have the tuning tool itself to help customers perform tuning operations on those endpoints without the assistance of TAC. Now, keep in mind, there are certain types of exclusions that, one, you will not be able to tune properly in debug and audit mode, rather in audit mode. Debug mode you can tune with for any of the engines, but audit mode not necessarily. But this will help with standard file system exclusions. What file extensions can I exclude? What paths can I exclude? What specific files can I exclude? This is where you can get that data, and this is how customers can kind of help themselves. The tool is hosted on GitHub. It's widely available. It's well documented, and we're working with development and pushing for, though we have not gotten acceptance yet, to get a multiple selection option for remote diagnostic fetch and for remote diagnostic download from the file repository. So this is what the tuning tool looks like and the output that you'll get. It's available at this GitHub location. It's our Cisco Security GitHub. It's called Windows Tune. It's an AMP level 5 script written by our support team. If you have enhancements for this, please reach out to me and let me know. If you go and play with it and you say, you know, this isn't quite giving me what I need, or it's not in the format that I wanted, or it's missing a feature that I'd like to have, please let me specifically know. I worked directly with the guys who wrote this stuff, and we can get additions made very quickly and pushed back out to the GitHub as an update. So be aware that I can be your point of contact for that. Basically what we're going to get is top 10 processes, files, executions, and file paths. Now, there's a lot more data in the file itself, but more or less what you're going to see is what's here on the right. When you have an extremely high value for processes, you might want to exclude that. This comes down to what an organization's individual security posture is and what they are willing to exclude. Now, exclusions are poking holes in your security. There's no way around that. There are a lot of ways to phrase that sound better, but in-house, that's what we're doing here, which is why we do not provide specific guidance on which of these files they should exclude outside of our recommended exclusion lists. They need to make that determination on their own, and they need to take on the liability for making those decisions. All right, one moment here while I pull up my demo video, and I'll walk you through there we go, wrong folder. Aha. Okay, so remote diagnostics and tuning. Again, there's a slide that outlines this very specifically at the end of the slide deck, and I'm happy to pass that slide deck out. But effectively, we're going to start by logging into the AMP for Endpoints console. This address changes depending on your region, or rather the region where the customer's AMP for Endpoints console is located. Simply log in. You will need two-factor authentication for this feature to work. So keep that in mind, and two-factor authentication is a requirement that you should always keep in mind when deploying in any environment. You'll go to your computers page, select any Windows endpoint. Right now, the remote diagnostic tool works for Windows and for Mac, but Windows endpoints are what we're focused on this time around. Now, I want to pause it here real quick. There are two buttons here, historical data. When we deploy an AMP connector in debug mode, it starts collecting all of the data. It kicks up the log level to the maximum, and it starts dumping all of that data into a file called sfc.exe.log. Now, when that file hits 52 megabytes, typically that file rolls over, it gets a timestamp attached to it, and a new one is created. In debug mode, that file will continue to roll over 11 times before the old one is dropped off the endpoint. When you run this tool by default, you can set a 15-minute debug session, and it will create that file at full log level for 15 minutes. If the connector is already in debug mode, there may be 7, 8, or 11 or more, no more than 11, but there may be more sfc.exec.log files there than was created by triggering this behavior. If you do not check that historical data button, this will only upload the log files for the last 15 minutes. If there are older log files, it will not collect them. I recommend always leaving the historical data button checked. When we go to tune, all of that back history is very useful data for us. Now, the other button here is kernel log level. If we're having issues with a system driver on a specific endpoint, maybe our system protect driver is misbehaving, maybe we're running into problems with our network driver because of an incompatibility with another security product. If you're seeing odd behavior that is not related directly to tuning, you want to enable this kernel log button. This will gather additional log data from the endpoint drivers themselves and input it into that sfc.exec.log. That data is absolutely critical for TAC to be able to help you sort out and identify exactly what's going on that endpoint, and it is very beneficial to us. So my recommendation here is when collecting debug diagnostics using this tool, always give it at least 15 minutes and always check these two buttons. We may not need all the data we're getting, but I'd rather have it and not need it. So you'll get this nice little button, green box that says it's been requested. A few minutes go by, and we'll prep for this by going to the GitHub and downloading the tool. We grab the tool. This page has been updated. There's a new beta version out. So if you have a whole department worth of diagnostics, you can run against all of those diagnostics at one time and get an aggregate output for all of them. We'll go to File Repository back in the AMP for Endpoints console. We can filter based on diagnostics. Highly recommended to use the filter. It makes life a lot easier. And simply select the diagnostic you want to download. Unfortunately, we don't have a multiple select option here yet. I'm working on it. If you want to see it, please raise a feature request, and we'll get that done. Simply double-click the tool, and you'll see output like this. They should be in the same folder. Double-click the tool, and you'll get this summary file. And here's your data output. What files are used the most? What folders are used the most? What file extensions are used the most? What are we scanning over and over and over? Now, one other thing I want to say about this is that just because you see a situation where we have a lot of data or a lot of scans in a specific folder, but they're just one-offs, if you scroll through this and you see that this user directory on the desktop has 50,000 scans in it, but it's all one-off scans on individual files, that could be something like a compiler running. It's generating a lot of really tiny files that only exist for a few milliseconds, and we're scanning them that whole time. That may very well be something that you need to exclude or that the customer needs to take into account. High scan count does not necessarily mean it's the only type of exclusion to look at. So be sure to look down in the details below and scroll for file paths and folder paths that may not necessarily hit the high number scan for individual files, but are being scanned a whole lot and may still benefit from an exclusion. Hey, wait a second. Yeah, okay. So quiz time. Jeremy, you're up.
All right. Let me take the ball here. Or can you pass me the ball?
Yep, there you go.
Okay. Let's see. All right, everyone should be able to see the Kahoots game pin number. I hit a bug with multiple choice questions in that last Kahoot. I think a couple of you ran across it. That should be, I should have a solid workaround in place now, so bear with me there. All right, we got 6 players. Let's go, let's go, let's go. We got I think this is a 6 or 7 question Kahoot. We are combining, did you just take us all the way through GA deployment, Jesse?
No, this was through alpha deployment.
Okay, gotcha. All right, everyone, false alarm. We're not doing this Kahoot yet. We're doing it after GA is discussed. The next Kahoot will combine alpha, beta, and GA deployment all in one quiz.
Oh,
sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so pass me the ball back, and I will continue. Are there any questions while we're moving things around here?
Hey, Jesse, there is a question around tuning for Mac. Could you please comment on that part?
So there's a couple of pieces for the Mac tuning. One, Mac does automated tuning to a certain extent. There's a feature designed in Mac that helps tune out known problems. Additionally, our internal exclusion lists for Mac are very good. Part of this is just the difference in designs between Mac and Windows and the way the operating systems and the file systems function. You don't require the same level of tuning. However, if you are encountering issues, running the diagnostic tool on the Mac and then collecting that diagnostic, if you open it up, there will be a there is a specific file in there. I believe it's called file.io. .text, and that file will help list much of the same data, or it will help by listing much of the same type of data that you see in the Windows diagnostic. So the data is provided for you without additional tool, basically. I highly recommend that you take a diagnostic of a Mac and just look at it. You'll find the file without a problem. I don't have one pre-made right now, so I'm not going to show it to you, but that's a good point, and I will try to get it added to the slide deck for the future. Any other questions? I suppose I should hold that up myself. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Please throw your flag up if you have any other questions. Am I actually sharing my screen?
You are.
Okay. Okay, so we've accomplished the alpha deployment, right? We've gotten our endpoints configured. Our initial deployment is done. We've done some tuning. Everything at this point hopefully is going fairly well, and we're ready to take the plunge and the next step. So I want to reiterate this. Let's deploy these things in stages. We did our alpha deployment. We don't want to jump straight to GA deployment. We want to do another round of deployments before we hit the mainstream. And in fact, we may end up doing 2 or 3 rounds of beta deployment to make sure that we scale and step out our deployment for our organization prior to going GA and hitting the go button for everybody.
Hey, Jesse, what slide do you have up right now?
Beta deployment.
Okay, we still see feedback and question slide. You might unshare and reshare.
All right. Let me do that. Okay.
There we go. Now we're good.
Okay, great. Okay, so our beta deployment ends up being our second stage deployment, but it is the first stage at which we actually turn on all of our security features. And we start this phase of our deployment by turning the security features on for alpha. So we're going to take all of our audit debug connectors and we're going to move them to our active policy. And we want to wait at that point. We want to collect additional diagnostic data. We want to listen to our help desk and see if they're getting a number of complaints or calls from users. We want to see if additional issues are discovered in the field. Maybe we're having problems with certain software on our manufacturing floor, or maybe our software development team is screaming bloody murder. We want to find out exactly what's going on and where, and we want to give ourselves time to get that feedback from the field, okay? If we rush through this, we see more pain than if we wait, take a deep breath, maybe give it a day and see where we're at, okay? So patience, deploy in phases and be patient and wait to see what you get from your users and from the field. If you're getting odd behavior that you can't easily account for, open a support case with TAC. Get the ball rolling, collect those diagnostics and get them in the file repository. TAC can get access to that file repository and pull that data down. You don't even need to pass it to them anymore in most cases. It saves a whole lot of time if you collect diagnostics ahead of time or in concurrence with opening that TAC case. They can get tuning done very quickly if they have the data to work with and we're not waiting on turnaround time for data to show up. Additionally, TAC can go in and access the customer console if they're given permission. And when they do that, they can request the diagnostics as well. So be aware that those options exist and how we can speed up that process. Collect the diagnostics in advance, get permission from the customer so that TAC can access their console and request diagnostics as needed for further processing. Once you have that data, go back to stage 3. Go look at your console setup. Do we need to add additional exclusions? Do we need to change one or more of the engines that's enabled? Is there a feature setting that we need to turn on or off? Do we need to add data that we've seen to a custom detection list because we have software that we've discovered? Maybe we found out someone was running uTorrent in our environment and, torrenting off of our bandwidth. Maybe we want to go block that application and, maybe scold that user or send them packing. Whatever the case is, we want to take a look at the data we're getting from the field. We want to remediate and take action on the information we have at the time. While we're doing that and waiting for that data to come back from the field, we need to define what our beta target environment is. What's the next step? We chose a nice, relevant slice of our company for our alpha deployment, and we've gotten through that. We're getting ready to deploy beta. We're maybe waiting on feedback from the field. Now, where do we want to focus our beta deployment? Do we want to bring in larger swath of the same departments? Do we need to expand across more departments? Maybe we need to pick a different region to work with. You know, there are a lot of options here depending on the specific customer environment. So be sure that you take those things into account and ask some relevant questions of your customers. How do they want to approach it? What does their organizational structure look like, and how do we target those? Again, if there's a test environment for mission critical systems, we definitely want to make sure that we get those into the alpha and beta stages of the deployment. If we have 50,000 endpoints and we deployed to 5 as our alpha environment, maybe we want to deploy to another 5 or maybe 10 and bring our overall organizational representation of data in the AMP console up a level. We want to get a cross-section of as many departments and as many different endpoint functions as we can manage so that our exclusion lists become more targeted to the different groups that we're working with. And don't forget, we can repeat this stage as many times as we need to, right? There's no saying we have to do this in only 3 deployments. We can do it in 5 or 10 if needed. If you have 250,000 endpoints, you probably want to take it in slow rollout stages. It pains me to admit this, but our internal IT team with our Office 365 rollout, this is more or less what they're doing, and they're doing a great job of it. As much heartburn as it causes us, if they just went and pushed the button to everybody, it would be far, far worse. So deploy these things in stages and get it rolled out in groups. All right, so we've got our group defined. We've turned our alpha group on. Our security posture is growing up. We've elevated from a pug to a little hound here, and we're monitoring the console and making sure that as we deploy, our connectors are installing, they're reporting back, the registrations are happening, and we continue to collect diagnostic info. We're tuning as we go along here. We want to get as much tuning data as we can. Now you may notice this slide is exactly like the one from the alpha group. It's a little repetitive, and it's designed that way intentionally. This is part of the methodology. Be repetitious in a predictable way when doing these deployments so that we can ensure that we cover all of our bases and that we don't miss anything that's critical. So now we're just going to go ahead and activate beta. We've gathered the data. We've gone ahead and done our tuning. We've got all these diagnostics. If we needed to, we opened a connector or a support case with TAC. Maybe we worked with the Tier 3 team and ironed out some wrinkles in our deployment. It looks like we're ready to move forward. We've gotten our feedback from the field. Everything seems to look good, and our support phone lines aren't ringing off the hook anymore. We go ahead with our beta deployments, and we enable them and make them active. And then we're going to do it again, right? We're going to repeat this exact same stage again. We've gone through alpha, we've gone through beta, and we didn't go to GA, we just did beta again. And we're going to keep doing beta until we're comfortable and until we maybe hit that point where we deploy to another batch of endpoints and we don't get a whole lot of phone calls, right? We don't hear a lot back from the field. It just worked. That's the situation we want to be in, is we front load and deal with all of our problems up front, and then at the end when we're doing our mass deployments, our problems are small, we can cope with them, we can manage those problems and any issues that arise effectively. Now, I was told that the quiz comes after GA deployment, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that quiz, and we're going to go to stage 5, which is our GA deployment. Our last to deploy, and hopefully, if we've done everything right, and the gods of IT tech are with us, we have the fewest issues in GA deployment. This should look pretty familiar, right? We got through beta, we know what's going on, our connectors are tuned and organized, we've managed to get everything functional and streamlined with our deployment process. We know what steps we're going to take moving forward. This has been well documented, and we're comfortable with where things are at the moment. So we've made it through this kind of pitfall-laden maze, and we're ready to move forward. As we move forward, we want to start with our least important systems and move through to our more mission-critical systems and save those till the end. If we hit a mission-critical pitfall at the end of our deployment methodology, we can fix that. And it prevents customers from finding themselves in a situation of, oh, well, we bought this, and we tried to deploy to our servers, and everything broke. We're not going to install it anymore. We're going to put it on a shelf and forget about it. We don't ever want to find ourselves in a situation where customers are either asking for a refund or where they haven't deployed and they're scared to continue deploying because they ran into some issues. We want to get them through the deployment methodology as far as we can and get as much of their environment covered as possible in the most time-effective way possible without actually encountering a situation that is a full stop for the customer. If they got all their endpoints deployed, 90+% of them, and everything's working, and then they hit a couple of servers that they have issues with, they're much less likely to complain and ask for a refund and rip the software out of their environment, right? So we'll start the phased deployment. This is exactly like alpha, except we're deploying these connectors in active mode to begin with. You'll hand out new redistributables from the active environment, and we'll move forward from there, okay? We continue to grab remote diagnostics and troubleshoot systems as needed instead of proactively. We'll continue using that tuning tool. We'll continue working with TAC on an as-needed basis. And if we run into a significant pitfall, we revert back to our beta stage, right? Okay, maybe we put a full halt on general alpha deployment or general deployment, and we roll back and we start doing smaller incremental deployment steps again until we work through whatever problem it is that we encounter. At this point, our security posture and our ability to protect a customer environment should be maturing quite nicely. We should be at, much more like a wolf hunting down the malware in the environment and helping manage and maintain that environment than we were when we started, where we kind of ran around and bit people's toes as a pup. All right, here's where we're going to go ahead and take our break and let you guys do the quiz. We've gotten through general deployment. Next, we'll talk about integrations. And for the moment, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy for that quiz.
All right, let's try this again. And by the way, all of these phased deployments, most of you that are veterans on this call know that this is not always the way it's done, right? This is a best practices session, not a reality session. So although our customers probably should measure twice and cut once, we know they don't. But if you were going to do a deployment properly with the least pain, the least screaming from customers, you probably want to take it in a phased approach like Jesse's described. All right, that being said, let me pass the ball to, there we go, got it. Let me get this going.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi just cut out. I'm trying to get back up.
Okay.
I'm not sure what's happening here with my Mac. It's not being nice to me today.
Okay, everyone should be able to see the game pin. And we'll give everybody a minute or so to get logged in. Big fat Mike.
Did I see any raised hands or questions from the audience that we need to address?
I don't see anything in the Q&A panel.
Yeah, and no raised hands right now.
Okay, good deal.
Okay. See if we can't get everybody in within the next 20 seconds or so. We're about halfway there. Okay, so we have 10 players. If there's anyone else, this is your 10-second warning.
We lost Derp and our architect.
Unless they generated new names. All right, here we go. This covers alpha, beta, and GA deployments. When it comes to proxies, which answer is true? Choose one. Go. All right, so SSL decryption will definitely interfere and impede your AMP traffic. Someone else can chime in here, but personally, for any AMP deployment I was involved with, I had them whitelist the needed addresses in their proxy rather than mess around with any kind of configuration in the proxy settings. Next question, Killer Mike. All right, so next question. When deploying your alpha testing environment, it is recommended to deploy, and this is another choose one, right? All right, good. Good to see that no one chose execute mode set to active. That's the thing you never do.
I think that's only for customers we don't like.
Yeah, you do that to your worst enemy, right? Okay, third question. The Windows connector tuning script found on GitHub. Choose one. There we go.
I just want to take a second to elaborate on this.
Yes.
So the connector tool is great. It was written by our support team, but if you call into TAC, or if a customer calls into TAC and says, hey, I'm trying to use this support tool and I can't figure it out or it's not working, what they're going to tell you is, I can't help you with the tool, give me the diagnostic, I'll tell you what you need to work with, or I'll give you the data that you would have gotten out of the tool. They're not going to help you use the support tool. They will give you the data that you would have otherwise gotten from the support tool.
Right, and I mean, the way I would use this is I would make the link to the GitHub repository available to my customer and explain to them that they're welcome to use this on their own. The description and the instructions within the GitHub are pretty clear, pretty simple. But yeah, I would stress that if they try to open a case with this, they're going to start back at square zero and need to provide that diagnostic package to TAC. Next question. The Cisco Security Connector. Choose one.
Can I get one of those carrying pouches? That's cool.
It should come with one. But
right?
Cisco emblazoned velvet carrying pouch.
We got to find a nice combination of the umbrella and AMP logos for that one.
Yeah, there's only one type of AMP for endpoint license. Whether we're talking about for a VM or we're talking about iOS, whatever connector it is, it's all one license. It only consumes one license seat, so there's no special license for iOS.
There is, depending on what MDM you're running, you may need a license for that MDM. However, there are free MDMs out there that will work just fine for deploying Clarity and the iOS connector. So if you have, for example, a Meraki MDM, you may need an additional security license for that, but otherwise there is not a requirement there for it.
Yep, good to clarify. Okay, so we got a couple more questions here. Little Mike in the lead, just barely. When moving from alpha to beta deployment, you should choose one. As much as we want to ignore complaints from users, probably not a good idea. Yep. Someone chose disable map in Xprev. I'm hoping it's a joke, but I think I understand the joke. Let's go on to the next question. When moving your deployment to general or GA, choose which one is correct. All right, let's see. Yeah, everyone got that one correct. Yeah, I mean, you could place all machines in the same group, but probably not a great idea, and definitely not a best practice. All right, the winner was Little Mike with the second place from Sturgeon Rothrock.
Good job, guys.
Back to Jesse. The ball is over to you.
Great. Let me reshare my screen here. And let's see. We're a good way through the slide deck here. You guys want to keep going, or do you want to take a break?
Show of hands. Raise your hand if you want to take a break, I guess.
I don't think we have any takers. All right. Let me, man, Windows keyboards with Mac are not the nicest thing in the world. Okay. So, we've gotten through our alpha deployment, and now we're going to take a couple of minutes and we're going to talk about some integrations. This is going to be a very brief discussion. If you want specific details about a specific integration, please reach out or check back with the user guides and the deployment strategy guide that are out there right now. They'll provide specific details. So skip over that. All right, so what integrations do we have right off the top of our head? Cognitive Threat Analytics, or Cognitive Intelligence as it is now known, I need to update the slide, is a third-party integration that comes with your AMP purchase. It's integrated right into the console. It's easy to set up and configure. You just click the Cognitive button on the main dashboard when you first log in. It's in the middle right of the page. It'll redirect you to the Cognitive Intelligence page, and from there you'll find instructions on how to configure the integration. Cisco Threat Response. Cisco Threat Response comes with AMP for Endpoints. This is probably the best orchestration tool I have ever seen, and if you haven't played with it, please sit down and go to one of the threat hunting workshops, get a good deep dive into Cisco Threat Response. I think your customers will be amazed. I find it to be a huge upsell point, specifically because it doesn't just give us a lot of granular information about AMP for Endpoints, but it also brings together integrations with ThreatGrid, Umbrella, email security. It integrates with VirusTotal. It integrates with the AMP backend to bring disposition data out. This tool gives us a whole lot more flexibility and insight with a much broader brush, as well as response tools in a single orchestration hub than you'll find pretty much anywhere else. AMP, by default, integrates with ThreatGrid. When you set up an AMP for Endpoints console, you get 100 submissions a day to the ThreatGrid sandbox. You have to configure those submissions by modifying your user account, enabling file fetch, and then configuring file submission on a per user or per group basis. It's highly recommended that you configure this and use this within most customer environments. If there is a privacy-focused customer, they may wish to disable this feature, or they may wish to bring the sandboxing in-house. Either way is fine, but be aware that this is here. It is there by default, and all you need to do is go in and turn it on per group. AMP Unity will bring ESA, CES, WSA, and FMC event data into the AMP for Endpoints console. Please note, this does not bring in network telemetry data. This does not bring in file system data. This only brings in event-related data. The AMP for Endpoint API has a stream setup whereby you can configure up to 5 streams to export events, any event that AMP supports, into whatever theme you have. Splunk and QRadar, we have pre-built packages for. Logstash, I believe it is, has their own pre-built packages that they designed to integrate with AMP for Endpoints. Elk is very straightforward to integrate with AMP for Endpoints with a simple Python script or a simple Ruby script. If you have an alerting system, integrating that alerting system with using the API by filtering for event IDs and then triggering an email alert or a ticket generation is very easy to do. It's simply a matter of understanding what's available to you there and configuring the event streams properly. And you can also use the API to integrate with your ICE engine. This feature functionality will be being built out in the future as we bring endpoint isolation to the forefront. So general best practices. We've gotten through our integration section. If you have questions about a specific integration, please throw your hand up. I'm happy to talk about it in more detail if you like. But for now, we're going to move on to best practices if nobody throws their hand up. Okay, one question we hear a lot. Is my whatever VDI environment supported? Can I virtualize this? Does it work? Yeah, it does. We can clone these things. We can make them work. We can definitely make lots of little sheep out there without a problem. So first question, is your vendor supported? AMP for Endpoints is vendor agnostic. I don't care what virtual environment you're running, as long as the operating system that you're virtualizing is supported, i.e. if I'm running a VMware environment, if I'm virtualizing Windows on top of that VMware environment, yes, you can run AMP for Endpoints in that VM. It will work. Now, will it work cleanly? Will it work right off the bat? Not necessarily. It's going to require some tuning, more so than your general workstations and laptops, but it can be done, and it can be done well. The virtual host operating system, such as the VMware hypervisor, is not always supported. In fact, VMware as a hypervisor is not supported in terms of installing AMP on the hypervisor. Microsoft and Red Hat, you can install on the hypervisor itself. Citrix and VMware, you cannot. Most hypervisors are not directly supported. All right, so we have two primary types of virtual machines. We have persistent and we have non-persistent. With persistent virtual desktops, you're just creating cloned virtual machines and users log into those virtual machines and do their job. In persistent virtual desktop environments, it's very easy to manage AMP for Endpoints. It functions just like any other desktop or laptop. With persistent VDI, you should really focus on creating the gold image that you're using to spin up those persistent virtual desktops and getting that process done correctly. I want to call this out and kind of wave the red flag here. Gold image creation is the single most important piece of a proper VDI rollout. If you don't get the gold image created correctly, you're going to run into problems. Those problems tend to include duplicates in your console and the fragmentation of your historical record. This tends to irritate customers, and it makes these rollouts a lot harder than they should be. There is a well laid out document in TechZone, and I believe I have the link in here to it, to how to do this. This has recently changed, so if you are familiar with doing this in the past and creating gold images by simply clearing the local XML file, that is no longer a functional approach to creating gold images. You'll need to review that document on TechZone. There's a lot more steps to it now. With 6.2, they changed the mechanism by which we track endpoints, and it does require additional configuration. So be aware of that, and please go take a look at that document and review when needed. Now, non-persistent virtual desktops do require additional configuration, and they need to be configured prior to deployment. But both options need to take into account how exactly we're going to manage AMP for endpoints on that virtual machine, and how we're going to configure our gold image, and whether or not we need identity persistence. So we're going to talk about identity persistence next. What is this feature, and why have I not seen it in my console? If you haven't seen identity persistence in your console, it's because you haven't asked TAC to turn it on for you. We hid this feature about 3 years ago. It used to be readily available in your console, and you could just go click the button. We took it away because customers were turning this on thinking it would solve problems that it was not designed to solve, and they were creating a large number of problems instead. So now if you want to use this feature, you need to open a support case with TAC, and TAC will actually push that up to the escalations team and enable it for you. Now, AMP for Endpoints tracks endpoints based on a UUID. This UUID ends up getting recycled if the virtual machine is not re-imaged and deployed properly. Now, we've got some new methodology behind this, which is why our gold image creation documents have changed, and that process has been updated. Now, identity persistence is designed to take and map new UUIDs based on a host name UUID pair, and map new UUIDs with a duplicate host name to the original host name. In this way, we prevent duplicate entries from being created, and we can prevent the fragmentation of that historical record. This is also really important in virtual environments for keeping your license count down. If you have a lot of duplicate records being created, then you're using up additional licenses. Now, AMP for Endpoints does not do license enforcement, but if a customer starts using 5,000 more licenses than they've purchased, our our back-end folks will notice this, and we'll have someone reaching out to the customer going, hey, do you need to buy more licenses because you're way over count, which usually ends up being a support case to resolve duplication issues. So there's two primary types of identity persistence. You can configure identity persistence by host name, which is what we recommend, and you can configure it to map by MAC address. Not so high on the recommendation list. And the reason for that is most workstations have more than one MAC address. If you have a Wi-Fi connector, an Ethernet connector, and a Bluetooth adapter, for example, you have 3 MAC addresses. Each of those communications methods gets its own MAC address, and as such, by host name is the best practice. This is also useful because in a lot of cases, when you're spinning up VDI environments on demand based on customer login, a lot of times those host names are based on a username. So you'll log in and it'll be like Windows 7-Jane H or what have you. And it's that way every time that user logs in. So even though that user may be getting a fresh, brand new spun up VM, they're still getting associated with an existing AMP for Endpoints record. Now this allows us to track behavior of the endpoint based on the user, not so much based on the host name. It's kind of one with the other in this instance. But it provides that continuity of historical record. Now you can also activate identity persistence in 2 other ways, or rather with, one is how you turn the feature on and how it maps. The other is how we map that feature across our business. Are we only enabling it for specific computers in a specific policy, or are we enabling it for all of our computers across our entire business? Now, the recommendation here is to map across business. The reason for this is that when you map based on just policy, anytime a connector is moved in or out of that policy, you will get a duplicate record created. Additionally, if you have a connector call home and it falls into a default group and it's a VM, then that will create another duplicate. So by business or by hostname across policy is the recommended configuration for identity persistence in most environments. Oh, one last thing. If you're deploying to VDI, be aware you need to configure this by policy before you download the connector install package. This is really important. If this is not correct, things break. The identity persistence will start creating duplicates. It needs that flag to know to check for existing records on initial install. There's a couple of reference slides here about the differences between MAC address across business and policy and hostname across business and policy. The one big call out that I want to flag here is that if you have a customer that is onboarding and offboarding endpoints to and from different domain environments on a regular basis, or that is absorbing new customers on a somewhat regular basis, there is a difference between the host name and the fully qualified domain name, the FQDN. If you set up identity persistence to work based on host name, the FQDN is a different host name. It treats both fields as the same, and unless they are identical, it will create a duplicate record. So if you have an onboarding going on, you probably want to make sure that your records are FQDN, not just by host name. As those machines join the domain, they may create a single duplicate, and you may need to go back and clean that up, or you want to onboard and then deploy. Please enable all identity persistence settings uniformly across all policies. This ensures that we do not get additional duplicates simply by moving an endpoint or a child group between policies. Without uniform consistency of this setting across all policies, we always run into problems. So please do that. If you need identity persistence, check with TAC. They can get it enabled for you. Some of the main pitfalls, I've already touched on these, so I'm not going to linger here, but group policy configuration settings, consistent, and don't use sync by MAC address unless you're sure that there's only one MAC address on that machine. So a lot of the common questions we see when talking about VDI environments are, why do I keep finding duplicates? Can I use Tetra? Should I use the AMP network driver or the DFC driver in a VDI environment? Do I need specific exclusions? These are really common. I've been asked these so many times while I was in support, and they all have interesting answers. So duplicates. If you have a customer that is experiencing a lot of duplicates, then chances are they have not done the deployment preparation for VDI properly. Or they're deploying gold images to physical machines and they don't have the AMP connector properly configured on that endpoint machine or on that gold image. If you have inconsistent group configurations and you move it between groups with different identity persistence policies, you're going to see duplicates. Now, if you see issues with duplication in the customer environment, my recommendation is honestly not to spend a lot of time trying to troubleshoot this yourself. Double check that you've hit the high points of the best practices and then open that support case. Go ahead and get diagnostics quickly and effectively and get that support case open. TAC can clean up duplicates for you and save you a whole lot of time. Brandon's got a question for us. 1 second, Brandon. Let me unmute you here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify. So let's say we have a customer with mixed environment. They have, static machines they have non-persistent VDI environment as well. Are you suggesting to enable identity persistence even in those other groups that are non-virtual?
Absolutely. It will not create additional complications for those endpoints, but if any of your VMs ever ends up in a physical workstation or laptop group by accident, it will prevent duplication.
Okay, understood. Thanks.
Really good question. Okay, so yeah, TAC can help you clean this up and troubleshoot this. So please use TAC as a resource here. They are your best friends when it comes to these problems. Okay, so the AMP network driver and VDI. As I said before, the DFC driver, the network driver, can create network latency for specific server types, and as such can negatively impact performance in those scenarios, if not outright break things. So be aware of the situation in which you're working. If you're working with virtualized servers, maybe you don't want DFC working or installed. However, for standard desktop or for standard workstation virtual machines, there is no incompatibility with the network driver for VDI. You can absolutely use this in VDI environments if you so choose. There's no real underlying issue here. Just make sure that if you're using it with servers, you know what server type, and when appropriate, you're disabling the installation of the driver for those servers. Tetra, go for it. Absolutely. Just like any other signature matching AV, proper exclusions work just fine. You can deploy this on pretty much any environment at this point, and you should not run into any major issues. If you are spinning up VDIs from scratch and doing basically fresh deployments of AMP for endpoints in a VDI environment, it is highly recommended that you use the AMP update server or that Tetra redistribution server. Without that, you'll constantly be reaching out to the AMP backend, trying to download definition files, and they may not even finish downloading before the user kills that VM, and then somebody else logs in and spins up a new one. So be sure you have the Tetra redistribution server in a VDI environment. It will save a lot of bandwidth and prevent a lot of overhead that doesn't really serve any functional purpose. Now, VDI environments are not workstation environments, not standard workstation, physical desktop, laptop environments. Often, we do need to create additional exclusions. It's highly advisable to exclude mounted drives, especially if they're not mounted as a root drive, if they're, say, mounted into a folder on the C. It's always a good idea to find those drives and exclude them. Instead of scanning those drives on the endpoint, install AMP for endpoints on the server that is hosting those files and scan them at that location. This prevents a lot of overlap. You don't want 10 workstations all mounting the same drive and having AMP for endpoints scanning that mounted drive. Instead, you want one endpoint connector seeing file activity on a local share and scanning it there. That way you don't have the I/O overhead that can kill disks if left unchecked, occurring in production environments. I don't know, do we have another quiz, Jeremy?
We do.
Awesome, and it is quiz time.
The final quiz.
We're coming into the home stretch, folks.
And you should be able to see the game pin now. Everyone pile in quickly. If you're going to play this round, got about 20 seconds to get in. Okay, we're going to go ahead and kick things off. Everybody ready? Here we go. Covers VDI deployments, and the first question is persistent virtual desktops, and choose the right answer. Excellent. So yes, they're treated like any other desktop or laptop. Deployment is the same way, right? No special licensing. We're vendor agnostic as far as the platform, you know, whether it's Citrix or VMware or what have you. So let's go to the next question. Dirk Diggler is in the lead. The identity persistence feature, choose one. Seconds. All right, yep, it prevents the creation of duplicate computer objects in a dashboard. It's one of the things you check for whenever a customer tells you they're seeing repeats in their dashboard. Dirk's maintaining the lead. Let's go to the next question. Identity persistence identifies endpoints based on which two VM-specific features? The softball question, folks. Should not have any issues with this one. Five seconds to get your answer in. Yep, so it's hostname or MAC address, but hostname is preferred. Hostname is the one you want to go with. For the reason Jesse mentioned earlier, most machines have multiple MAC addresses, so you're going to want to, avoid that little challenge by going with hostname. Let's see, we got another question here. Dirk's still in the lead. Identity persistence must be enabled by. Yes, TAC. Now, technically, the admin has to go in and adjust the policy, but as far as enabling it, period, the first step is Cisco TAC. A lot of people do not realize this. You'll even run across older documentation that makes reference to the setting in the UI, which will not be there if you don't have it enabled by TAC. So definitely enable it via TAC. Next question. Duplicate connector records can be caused by, choose one. All right, yes, that's correct. Everybody got that one right. Improperly cloning imaging endpoints. The other thing that can cause it, which I believe Brandon asked a question about, is moving a machine from one group to another where the policy does not have identity persistence enabled. So if you move it from a policy that does have it to a group with the policy that does not have identity persistence, you will see a duplicate record.
One other thing I want to call out here is there are two situations where you can see misbehavior around virtual machines and cloning. One is where you've cloned improperly, and every time a new VM spins up, you get a duplicate record. The other is where you've cloned improperly, and all of your machines in a specific, all of your recently deployed machines are reporting to the same record. The second one is harder to detect, and it tends to be, where I've seen it, is your central office they get the deployment methodology right. But then you've got a secondary office, maybe out in APAC somewhere or out in EU somewhere, and they said, oh, well, I know how to clone software on a machine, and they didn't pay attention. And the next thing you know, you have 200 endpoints fighting over a single back-end record. So be aware both situations can happen. The second one is most easy to identify by going to the audit log and seeing how often a host name changes based on the GUID. And you'll see updates in there every 10 or 15 seconds with hosts fighting over the specific GUID and changing the host name.
Yep, great call out there. So our winner for this final round of Cahoots is Dirk Diggler, second place Beepo, and then CrowdStrikes is in third. All right, great job.
Yeah, there we go. Awesome. Let me click the share button here. Okay, so we're almost done. You guys have been great so far. I appreciate the questions and the interactivity with the quizzes. I hope you find them to be a little bit fun. I definitely find it interesting and entertaining to see the answers we get. So
I find the names interesting and entertaining.
It's usually the best part is the people's names.
Absolutely. Okay, so I've got the last two slides here, and then if anybody has questions or they want more information on anything specific, please let me know. So the last two slides, the first one is update recommendations. You've got a customer, they've had AMP for Endpoints deployed in their environment for quite a while now. Maybe they're on an old version and they're ready to update. They've gone through their change management and they're ready to take that leap. If they have followed our policy and group organizational best practices, this becomes fairly trivial, right? You go in, you modify the one policy for updates associated with the endpoints that they want to target, and you set the connector upgrade window and the connector version that they want to move to, right? Then you simply take the child group, and as we saw before, you just move that child group right into the update parent group. All of the configuration settings will remain the same, except for the update. The update will get downloaded and installed. Now, there's a couple of caveats here, one of which is do not ever update without planning it to be in conjunction with a maintenance window where reboots will occur. If you update a connector, oftentimes, most often, that connector will stop functioning until a reboot occurs. I saw a hand go up, so let's see what question we've got. Adrian, what you got?
So Pages, I was getting this question for initially when you did the parent-child group policies. In this case, the policy that you only change in the parent group, right?
Yes.
The child policies the child groups have no policy attached, just connectors.
So the child policies, or the child groups rather, inherit their policy from the parent.
Yeah.
So by changing the parent group policy and just moving the child group, we get a new policy associated with it with those settings configured.
Understand. All right.
Good question. Anything else? I see Brandon's got his hand up. Brandon, what you got?
Yeah, actually, mine was back on VDIs. I tried to get it up before the quiz. Is there any additional information for linked clones, instant clones, or the Citrix machine creation process? Any suggestions around those for those VDI situations?
So what I can say is I have seen AMP for Endpoints function in those environments. They do require additional configuration, and they need to be thoroughly tested prior to broad-scale deployment. It will work. It does take some additional work to make sure that it's functioning optimally. And what I would do if you're running into those environments is wait to deploy to those environments last, and then engage with TAC and the BU escalations group to make sure that any issues you have are ironed out as rapidly as possible. If we run into, for example, a weird compatibility bug in whatever custom configuration the customer has going on there, if you're engaged with the escalations team, they can work directly with development to get that bug resolved rapidly. They're your best option for that, and they see the majority of this. Now, it is on my to-do list to create documentation around exactly the use cases that you just asked about. Unfortunately, my to-do list is a mile long, and it is not the top priority that I have at the moment. I will get it created as soon as I have the option to get the environment set up and tested properly.
Okay, Jesse. Yeah, we're actually, a couple of SCs are working on updating the document, at least marking it up where we need updated screenshots and whatnot. So I'll send that over to you as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to take a look at it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, Jesse, here's another one that came through connected to the VDI. In particular, creating golden images. If we choose to run Tetra, can we get the initial DAT file installed first, then snapshot the golden image to avoid the download overhead?
So I have heard that people have tried this. I have not heard whether or not it has been successful. I do not believe that it will function. My understanding is that because of the way the definitions function, it will work for a limited period of time, and then the definition files will become outdated, and it will trigger a re-download of the entire package anyway. So unless you're updating that golden image on, say, a weekly basis, I'm not sure where the benefit would be.
Yeah. So, hey, Todd, as a follow-up, shoot a note to the team, ATS-TME, and we'll find out the timers on the initial download of the definitions file, and so you'll know how valid it is or how long it can be used, and have the expectation, set the proper expectation with the customer as to when they'll have to reinitiate a full download. But shoot me an email so we don't forget, please.
Okay, I see question marks next to Renee and Todd. I'm not sure if you guys have questions to ask or something else.
Yeah, so I just acknowledged Todd. Let me see if Renee, the question hanging out here that, oh, no, it was a comment from earlier, so I'll acknowledge that. And
okay.
I think we're good.
Great. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, please always make sure that you schedule connector updates right before maintenance windows. I would give them about 3 or 4 hours before that maintenance window kicks in, allow the maintenance window to run through, reboot the endpoint, and when it comes back up, new connector version and everything's fully functional and operational. It's really critical that customers understand that a reboot is almost always required. We will call out in the documentation when there is a version update that does not require a reboot. In fact, we call out both when it does and when it doesn't in the release notes every time a new version is released. Additionally, we are working currently, the development team is making strident efforts to alleviate this concern entirely and move away from a reboot required update model to one where reboot is not required, where we can swap out the drivers on demand, but that has not reached general deployment yet, and we do not have a confirmed date for when that's going to hit customer usable downloads. So just be aware that this may change in the future, but for right now, always reboot. Okay. This is kind of my last slide here, other than a quick reminder. For troubleshooting, if you need a step-by-step, here it is. Go to your computer's page, click your diagnose button. Give it the maximum time, leave the other 2 boxes checked, hit create. This is going to download the file into the file repository. You can filter it on Connector Diagnostics. From there, you can expand the record and simply select download. This will give you access to every diagnostic that you can collect right there via the console. We do not at this time have group downloads or batch downloads, and we do not have the group diagnostic option available to us. I'm pushing to get those done. I'm also pushing to get this available via the API. If you see the use case for that and you think that that would be beneficial to your customers, please raise a feature request along those lines so that we can let development know to prioritize it. And with that, I'm available for questions until you guys all bail on the session, but otherwise, I'm out of material. Please remember to deploy in stages. Yay!
With 28 minutes to spare.
Have to admit, I was overly worried about nothing. I will say my voice is rather hoarse, though.
Yes, we have a question from Craig.
Customer on a POV right now concerned about the quarantine folder and where the files go. I know there's a quarantine folder that we automatically create and we rename a file or a malware file and put it in that quarantine folder. I guess the question overall is, what are the best practices that you guys see out there recommend for cleaning up quarantine folders? I know the default is that it automatically gets wiped after 30 days, but what if a customer doesn't want that wiped? What if they want to take the file from there, or they use a tool to do the wiping? In one of our guides, we say use a tool to do that. We don't really recommend the tool. It seems rather ambiguous on our directions here in our documentation around the whole issue of how to deal with quarantine files.
So the standard practice is leave the files alone in the directory that they're in, and the system will automatically clean them up. Now, if the file is marked as malicious, I would say that, one, you can go grab the SHA of that file, and since it's the actual hash of the file, you know that it is the same as any file that you can find on, for example, VirusTotal or within the ThreatGrid database that matches that SHA. So if you want to perform an analysis on it or tear that file apart or store it for some reason, have at, go grab it from one of those sources. If it's not available via those sources, I'm actually not 100% sure what the best way to go about getting it would be. But in terms of cleaning it up faster than that, there is no available option at this time within the policy to change the retention period. And I'm not sure that development would be willing to build one right now. So I just don't really see the use case for that. Maybe I'm missing something.
Are we unique in the way we handle that with our competitors?
I'm sorry?
Do our competitors like Carbon Black and CrowdStrike, Cylance, et cetera, is it similar kind of a way that they deal with quarantine files?
I don't think I can answer that question. Panelists, do we have anybody who can speak to that?
I've literally never heard this question come up, and I would pose the question back to the customer: is your intention to reduce file footprint on the disk, or does it give you a warm, fuzzy feeling that all the files deemed malicious, even though they're inert at this point, be removed from the hard drive physically? I have no idea why they're asking, right?
I think it's the latter. It's the latter, and it kind of goes back to the legacy of AV. I want to know that that thing's wiped out, it's not on there, but I don't want to wait 30 days, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, between you and I'm curious if they know how McAfee did it or whoever their incumbent was before. I bet they don't. But yeah, I don't know how, other than to explain how those files are inert and unable to execute at that point. I don't know how else to address that, really. And I've never actually had it come up.
If they ever do want it for forensics purposes, what they should do is do a file fetch, send it to ThreatGrid. That way they'll have not only the file, but also the analytics.
Absolutely, yeah. That would be the approach I would recommend.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question related to Linux connector.
Sure.
What is the showstopper for Ubuntu or Debian based?
So it's not so much that there is a particular showstopper. The issue is that the development process on those kernels moves very quickly, and the operating systems for those particular systems changes very fast. So in order to support them and maintain support for them, we have to have dedicated development resources willing to stay on top of that, and we need funding and ability to do that, which means we have to have enough customers interested in it with a broad enough deployment base to justify it. And at this point, we haven't hit that threshold.
Understood.
Alex, I see your hand up.
Muted. Oh, there I am. Hey, I had this question earlier, and because I think I misheard what you said, but maybe. On the Tetra, the local Tetra update servers, my understanding is, so when you configure that, you put in the URL, right? So it's going to be your local, something that's accessible on your local LAN. And if the endpoint moves off the local network, it's still going to use that URL, right? So it just needs to be something that can be resolved either internally or externally to the same Tetra server, or at least a Tetra server at your organization. But I thought you mentioned something about it would go to the public cloud, but I didn't think that was the case.
So what I recommend is, if you have remote workers, simply don't configure Tetra update server, the URL for those workers. Put them in a different group with a policy that does not have that configuration, and allow them to reach out to the cloud.
Okay. Yeah, but right, because that's kind of a common ask, and if there was some way to make that more flexible, that would be a feature I'd like to see, but that's here nor there. But
yeah,
Alex,
I think fallback.
Yeah,
I think fallback to the cloud is already in the feature request list. It would be something very, very, very cool if we can do it right, and we may be able to in the future. Was the question prompted in your mind when Jesse was still talking about VDI stuff?
No, it was way back here. No, it was way back in the slide he's talking about here. I thought he said it would go to the cloud if it's off. I'm good. But what you're saying is configure the remote to just go to the cloud, which, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, cool. To the other question about Linux distro support, so I put this as a typed reply to a question. If you have customers that are asking for additional distro support, we want to know. And so even though we don't support Ubuntu or name a Linux version, Debian, if you can get us counts, that helps us to track when we do roadmap review and consider additional Linux distros once we can add up the numbers, right? So 100 from one customer is insufficient alone, but if I get 1,000 from 100 customers, that begins to move the needle of consideration so that we can say the effort to get support on this platform could return a decent number of sales that would cover the time invested. So if you have the question from a customer, get us the details on number, right? So how many desktops or servers or both we're talking about, and particulars of the platform. Do they run custom kernels? Do they run standard kernels? Those are the kind of things we need to know that help us make a better decision.
Craig, did you have another question that you'd like to ask?
I did, yes. I got two, actually.
Great.
I noticed that on the legacy device trajectory screen, I don't see a retrospective icon, and I seem to recall that was in there in the past. I know for sure it's in the FNC legend, and I expected that to be in the AMP console as well. It's not there.
So
there's a recall, or not recall, restore. There's a restore icon, but not a retrospective icon.
So I know we see the retrospective events show up in the event listing. I haven't looked at the device trajectory for that particular icon in some time, so I'm not sure how to answer that question other than to say, have you looked at the new version of device trajectory to see if you find it there.
No, it's not there either. In fact, there is no legend for the new device trajectory view. You can flip back and forth between legacy and the new. Well, you have to click on the upper left. There's a Java pop-up for the new one. If you pop on that, it's got the same legend as the legacy.
That's interesting. So we moved the new one to GA about a month ago now, and everything goes to the new one by default unless you're doing a non-SHA-based query. So you'll probably encounter the legend hidden under a pivot menu, but it is there. And I'm a little surprised that we're not seeing those, and I'm wondering why. So I'll take a look and see what I can find out from development. I thought it was there, but maybe a change was made that I missed out on.
Yeah, I can take a screenshot and send it to you and show you in both screens, the legacy and the new one.
Yeah, that'd be great if you wouldn't mind.
The other question is if on a recall, if I'm in the event and I've got a piece of, I see a file there that's convicted or quarantined, and I want to recall it in the audit log. I guess I want a description between, I don't see a delineation in the audit log between a manual recall that I did versus a cloud recall. So I'm trying to see if, I'm assuming a cloud recall, or I guess if I click on the recall, does that trigger a cloud recall in my audit log?
I believe it does.
Okay.
I would have to test it. I haven't looked at it that closely.
Yeah,
so
it does.
I'm sorry. Question.
Okay, that was my speculation, but it wasn't clear when I was looking at the audit log that that was triggered by the manual recall clicking on that button. So
whether it's the folks, you know, in Calgary or Red or Talos or whomever, or an analyst in the console clicking the button, the job has to work through the cloud systems. And so either way, it's kicking off what's called a cloud recall, even though it's a manual process. It may have been, you know, manually initiated because the job still has to be sent to the cloud server and find the connector GUID to inform, to put it back, all those. So it's still called a cloud recall. Now, what you may be looking for, and if this is a customer request, they may be looking for a more discrete audit trail that shows it was initiated by user or analyst versus the normal process, or what could be a normal process of initiated by Cisco.
Yeah, I would, you know, the customer didn't request it, but I saw it in the audit log and then in the events, and I was trying to discern if the customer did that or Cisco did it, and it's not, that granularity is not in the audit log. And I think if an admin is doing that, that needs to be logged in the audit log so that they know who did it.
Yep.
That's just my opinion. The customers are requesting it. That's just my opinion.
I haven't seen a customer request on it, but that does not mean it's not a good feature request.
Yeah.
Even though a customer hasn't asked for it.
Right, and it's not a deal breaker or anything like that.
You know how to get them logged. You know how to get the FMRs logged, right?
Yeah.
Craig, you know how to get the feature request logged, right? So that Bill Yazzie can put them into the tag request list?
Yeah, I think so. I don't do that typically.
Let's get it in there.
Yeah.
Let's get it in there.
Okay.
Great question. Yeah. I'm surprised that we're not auditing that on a per user basis, but it's definitely something that we should be. So, cool. All right. Any other questions? I'm seeing a lot of silence over here, so I'm guessing that folks are pretty happy with the way things went.
So we answered Craig's verbally. Thorsten has a question. When does ANFR-Endpoint download the whole Tetra engine instead of incremental updates? And I'm assuming it means the definition file. When does it download the entire definition file versus incremental update?
The initial download is the entire definition database, and then incremental updates after that. So it'll download that upon initial install.
Okay. So initial install, and then there is a time-based window, but Thorsten, we don't have that answer offhand. We'll get it and make sure we bring that answer back as to what that time-based is, the timeout on the validity of that, the initial install download, so that we know.
There looks like there's another question here about audit policy with Tetra System Process Protection XPrev while in audit mode. So when you use the audit policy, you'll find that a lot of these features are disabled by default because we don't have an audit mode for those features, which is why when we're doing exclusions, we need to exclude what we can for files and system processes and so forth while it's in audit mode, and then turn it on and run another round of exclusions. And then if we run into something that simply is not functioning with exploit prevention, for example, then we'll need to talk to TAC about that, provide them with the data, and they can add that exclusion for you on the back end. Hopefully we don't run into too many of these. So far it hasn't been a huge burden, but it is something that you should be aware of.
All right, and my WebEx just died, but before it died, I didn't see any hands or unanswered questions. We'll give it a minute more, see if anything comes through. All right, folks, thanks for the time today. Thanks for all the presenters. Thanks to Jesse and Jeremy and Alex and all the panelists, everybody that had something to do with bringing the content today. Tomorrow, we're set to go again, same time, same channel, and we're going to take a deeper dive on the endpoint itself and get into, I'm sorry for all the background noise. For some reason, my hunting dog decides he wants to be a security dog right now, and he's barking at that. He's normally very silent because he doesn't need to bark when we're in the field chasing birds, but right now he's very loud. But
we got one more question.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Thorsten just asked, does the update server also provide ClamAV updates? Unfortunately, it does not. The update server is for Windows only, and Windows does not use the ClamAV engine for file scanning. It only file types with the ClamAV engine, so it does not host ClamAV updates. You know, I'm saying that, and then I'm looking at my slide going, wait, it says it does over here, so maybe I'm wrong. I'm going to have to check. I thought it didn't, but maybe.
In the initial rollout, it did not. And I don't think they snuck it in. It was actually an ask of the team, but it didn't make it into the initial cut.
Okay.
It did not make it into the initial cut.
Then I need to change my slide to reflect that.
All right, folks. Tomorrow, the recordings and the links for the recordings will be sent out as soon as we have them. Thanks also to Mahesh for camping out with us for these almost 4 hours. Hopefully this was useful content and great info for you. Appreciate you guys making it interactive with questions and comments and insight. So let's keep it going tomorrow when we come back together to go deeper on the endpoint, look at all the detection engines, how they work together, and the value they bring. So appreciate it, folks. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.